Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world where the flickering torchlight dances off stone walls, the air smells faintly of rosewater and sweat, and somewhere nearby an entire court is settling in to watch two people, probably strangers, prove their marriage the old-fashioned way, awkwardly, publicly, and with way too many onlookers. Yeah, you probably won't survive this one emotionally, but we're doing it anyway. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now, just to see how many of you are up past midnight, trying to forget the modern world by diving into the deeply uncomfortable past. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing inside a medieval castle, one of those stone monstrosities with narrow windows and drafty halls that echo everything. You're not royalty, but tonight, you've been invited to witness something intimate. The bedding of a newly married couple. The scent of fresh rushes and damp stone fills your nose, and there's a buzz in the air. Half anticipation, half wine. It's not your wedding, thankfully, but you're about to get a front row seat to a very old tradition that blurs the lines between sacred ritual and public spectacle. The chamber is prepared meticulously. Heavy curtains drape around a raised bed that looks more decorative than comfortable. There are furs, embroidered pillows, and bowls of figs and roasted almonds, just in case the newlyweds work up an appetite. Candles line every available surface, dripping wax onto carved wood. The fire in the hearth crackles, casting a golden glow that fails to warm the mood. You glance around at the others, nobles in silks, priests with furrowed brows, and a few servants trying very hard to look invisible. They're all here for the same reason, to witness what happens next. Or at least to make sure it happens. This whole thing, by the way, isn't just about love or lust or whatever you might hope a wedding night could be. It's about legitimacy, proving the marriage is real. In an age where inheritance is everything and bloodlines need to be traced like prized livestock, the wedding isn't finished until it's confirmed. And confirmed means consummated. You don't get to just hold hands and hope for the best. It's weirdly ceremonial. Sometimes the couple is paraded through the hall, cheered on by guests holding torches and singing ribald songs. If they're nobility, they're probably still half sober from the feast that just ended. The guests form a procession, carrying the newlyweds to their chamber like they're on their way to a very unsettling coronation. The phrase bedding ceremony makes it sound quaint. It's not, it's an event, a performance, and the couple, they're the headliners, and no, they don't always get privacy. In fact, privacy is kind of the opposite of the point. In many places, especially in 12th to 15th century Europe, witnesses were required. There might be 4 or 6 or more, depending on the region and how suspicious the families were. These weren't creeps sneaking in the shadows. They were family members, clergy, sometimes even a physician, standing there in the corner, awkwardly clearing their throats while the bride and groom, who may have met just hours ago, tried to make history. Now, there were some variations. In some cases, the couple only had to lie in bed together while witnesses observed them in a state of undress. That alone could be enough to prove the union, though obviously it's a stretch. In other instances, it was full-on voyeurism. There are records of bedsheets being pulled up afterward to check for evidence, specifically blood. The presence of it suggested the bride was a virgin. The absence could, well, cause a scandal, and that scandal could ripple through kingdoms. This wasn't some fringe rural practice either. It was part of royal and noble protocol. In France, England, Germany, and even parts of Scandinavia, the bedding ceremony was standard. It had legal, spiritual, and social significance. A wedding wasn't official until it was consummated in the flesh. And to make sure no one could deny it later, say, during a land dispute or custody battle, it needed witnesses. Some might wait outside the chamber listening. Others stayed inside, chatting loudly to make the couple less nervous, as if casual small talk helps anyone in that situation. One fringe but confirmed tradition: in some German-speaking regions, the bride's relatives would throw nuts and sweets at the bed to ensure fertility and good luck. You can imagine the confusion. There's this deeply serious, borderline traumatic moment happening, and suddenly someone's pelting you with candied almonds. Not everyone agreed on how this should work. Scholars debate the exact origins of the practice. Some argue it stems from ancient fertility rites. Others say it evolved as a way to regulate inheritance. The church had mixed feelings. On one hand, they wanted sex within marriage to be sacred and private. On the other, They wanted proof that the union was real. This tug-of-war between modesty and legality created some truly bizarre customs, and the bedding ceremony was one of them. Now, if you're thinking this sounds humiliating and dehumanizing, you're right. But here's the twist. Some couples played along. There are accounts of newlyweds laughing through it, treating it like a weird party game. After all, many marriages were arranged, and physical intimacy wasn't a big emotional step, it was a chore to check off the list. In a world where your personal life was communal property, your body a bargaining chip, this was just another expectation to fulfill. But imagine yourself in that bed. You're a young bride, probably a teenager. You've just pledged yourself to someone older, maybe decades older, in front of God and half the countryside. You're ushered to the chamber with singing and candles, and then you're expected to strip, lie down, and get on with it. Maybe there's a curtain, maybe there isn't. And maybe, just maybe, you hear a priest cough in the corner while you try to figure out where to put your arms. It's disturbing, it's surreal, and it's, whoa, a real history. So now you're lying there, possibly still wearing part of your wedding garb, trying to process the evening's events while the door finally creaks shut and the footsteps of your witnesses retreat down the corridor. If you're lucky, they actually left. If you're less lucky, someone is stationed just outside, listening for suspicious silence. Either way, this is the moment you've spent months dreading, or, depending on who you are in this scenario, hoping will go by as quickly and forgettably as possible. Because here's the thing, this isn't the honeymoon fantasy modern romances have promised. In the medieval world, your wedding night has one singular purpose, to produce heirs, preferably male ones. Whether or not you like your new spouse doesn't factor into it. Whether or not they even speak your language is almost irrelevant. Love, affection, or compatibility, that's fairy tale nonsense reserved for minstrels and poets. Your marriage, like nearly all marriages of the time, is a transaction, a political agreement carved from property lines, treaties, bloodlines, and sometimes, unfortunately, desperation. If you're part of the nobility, your entire union might have been arranged when you were still drooling over mashed turnips. Marriages could be negotiated when children were 6, 7, even younger. The idea of growing up beside your betrothed, gradually developing a bond, is laughable. More often, your first real conversation with your spouse takes place on the wedding day, and the second conversation happens while trying to figure out which side of the bed is less lumpy. Of course, age gaps were absurd. Teenage girls, barely old enough to qualify as women under modern standards, were routinely married off to men in their 30s, 40s, even 50s. Why? Because men were expected to gain status and wealth before marrying, and girls were expected to be young enough to birth a small army of children. Which means tonight your new husband may be older than your father, and you're expected to treat this entire situation like an honour. It wasn't just nobles and royals dealing with these arranged matches, though. Even among commoners, marriages were often driven by survival more than romance. Your family might agree to the union because the other family owns good land or a sturdy cow, or is marginally less cursed by local gossip. Dowries, the transfer of goods or wealth from the bride's family to the groom, sealed the deal. Sometimes it's a plot of land, sometimes it's 10 geese and a dented cooking pot. Either way, it's a price tag, and your body is part of the package. And this price? It often came with expectations. Your ability to produce children was everything. For noble women, especially, your fertility was a political weapon. A duchess with no sons could unravel an entire succession plan. A barren queen might find herself quietly replaced, or worse, accused of witchcraft or infidelity. And because conception starts, in theory, on wedding night, everyone's watching closely. Not physically anymore, hopefully, but in spirit. There's gossip in the halls, whispers in the kitchens, wagers in the barracks. Did it happen? Was she pure? Did he manage it? These are the medieval equivalents of juicy celebrity scandals. Now picture this, you're sitting at breakfast the next morning, you've barely slept, your limbs ache, and someone from the household staff is folding up the sheets with a bit too much focus. In some noble houses, the evidence of consummation, namely blood on the linens, was a major point of pride. In extreme cases, those sheets were paraded through the town square like a battle flag, proving the bride was a virgin and the husband, well, functional. If no blood showed, people whispered, people speculated. And if your family was particularly cutthroat, they might demand a second try, with witnesses again. That may sound horrifying, and it is, but this wasn't even the worst of it. Sometimes, particularly in noble courts, you wouldn't even have a say in when the marriage became official. After the wedding feast, your new husband could simply carry you off in front of everyone, literally. The phrase carried over the threshold has roots in this very tradition, but in the medieval version, it's not sweet or symbolic, it's a performance of ownership. A man might lift his bride onto his shoulder like a sack of barley and march her toward the bedchamber, laughing nobles in tow, all of them joking and cheering and reminding him not to break her. Of course, you might be one of the more powerful parties in this arrangement, say, a princess of considerable dowry or political clout, and you could possibly delay the moment, maybe with the help of your ladies-in-waiting, or a well-placed excuse about illness, or just raw stubbornness. But even then, the clock would be ticking. Everyone would know you hadn't consummated the marriage, and that ticking clock wasn't just social pressure, it was legal. A marriage without consummation could be annulled. You'd be sent home, branded a failure, or worse, used goods. Some of these arrangements were so strictly transactional that love was considered a threat. There are documented cases where couples who fell in love after being married were treated with suspicion, even by the church. Love was chaotic. Love complicated alliances. Love encouraged emotional decisions. And in medieval society, emotional decisions got people poisoned, dethroned, or marched off to war. So if you did happen to fall in love with your new spouse, you probably kept it quiet, like a dirty little secret you whispered under your breath. And here's a fun little fringe fact. There are surviving accounts, mostly from frustrated medieval poets and chroniclers, of brides falling asleep during the ceremony. Not the wedding itself, the bedding. One exhausted girl, barely 15, reportedly passed out cold as soon as she hit the mattress. Her new husband, bewildered, called for a priest, a physician, and her governess, all of whom hovered in the room debating whether this was divine punishment, poor appetite, or demonic possession. Turns out she'd just had too much honeyed wine and hadn't eaten since sunrise. Romance. Still, scholars debate whether this was all uniformly enforced. Did every couple endure a public bedding? Not necessarily. Customs varied wildly by region, class, and century. In rural communities, the ceremony might be symbolic, laying together in bed fully clothed while elders watched briefly. In others, particularly in French and Scottish courts, it was formalised and mandatory, but regardless of whether the whole village crammed into the bedchamber or just a handful of witnesses stood by, the result was the same. The wedding night was never truly yours. It belonged to your families, your alliances, your future heirs, and unfortunately, the legal system. So as you lie back in that bed, exhausted and maybe a little numb, you realise the night is far from over. It's just the beginning of a long and strange journey, where your bedroom will never be truly private again. The feast has ended. The dancing is done. The wine has stopped flowing, though your stomach still sways with the aftershocks of whatever spiced mead they poured with wild abandon. You've changed, or rather been changed, into your nightclothes by a small fleet of attendants, some of whom you barely know. The chamber smells faintly of lavender, candle wax, and linen pressed by hand. You're standing on the edge of a raised dais where the bed waits, and beyond that bed, an audience. Still. Yes, still. Because for many medieval couples, the wedding night didn't begin in secrecy or end in private. In fact, it often started as an official continuation of the ceremony, like an encore performance except deeply personal and emotionally horrifying. What followed the exchange of vows wasn't a gentle send-off into married bliss. Nope, the guests stuck around. Not just any guests, either. These were the big ones: clergy, nobility, your new in-laws, your parents, possibly a bishop. Definitely that one courtier who stares too long and doesn't blink. This ritual had a name: consuetudo bedding, the custom of bedding. After the banquet, guests would literally escort the bride and groom to their bedchamber. And by escort, I mean they walked you through the halls like a ceremonial loaf of bread, singing bawdy songs, laughing, maybe tossing nuts or dried fruit at your head for good luck and fertility. You'd smile and pretend not to want to melt into the flagstones. Once in the room, things got even more intimate. Depending on the tradition, you might be stripped, gently or not, by your wedding party. This sounds romantic until you remember that you probably haven't even had a full conversation with your spouse yet. The ritual stripping of clothes wasn't just for show, it symbolised the vulnerability of marriage, the shedding of one's family identity. It also served another purpose, proving you were about to do what everyone needed you to do. In some cases, the bed itself became a stage, a four-poster construction with high wooden frames and heavy curtains. It looked impressive, until you noticed it was surrounded by chairs. Some guests sat, others stood, all observed. The couple would be led to the bed like actors onto a set. Candles were placed to ensure everyone could see what they needed to see. The bride would be laid down first, often with a prayer whispered over her head. Then the groom would follow. A few words of awkward encouragement might be offered. Someone might sprinkle herbs or recite a blessing, and then, the moment everyone pretended to ignore but secretly leaned into, silence. Sometimes the curtains were closed to give a thin illusion of privacy. Other times they remained open. It wasn't uncommon for a bishop or other ecclesiastical figure to oversee this part of the evening, ensuring that the union was moving forward in the eyes of God and kingdom. Occasionally, a priest would bless the bed itself. Think about that. Your sheets might be holier than the church altar. It's difficult to say whether this made things better or much, much worse. Now here's where it gets especially uncomfortable. In more theatrical traditions, the couple was expected to share a kiss. In bed. In front of everyone, a long one preferably, ideally with visible passion. If things went according to plan and the witnesses would slowly file out of the room once satisfied that intimacy was imminent, or had already begun. Sometimes they didn't wait that long, sometimes they lingered. Yes, lingered. That wasn't just a rare perversion, it was standard in some courts. There are historical accounts from 13th and 14th century France and Burgundy describing how witnesses, particularly high-ranking officials, remained in the room not just during the undressing but through the entire act of consummation. Don't picture a single awkward chaperone in the shadows. Picture 6, maybe 10 people, including your new mother-in-law, sitting nearby, whispering about technique and compatibility, perhaps even offering suggestions, no pressure. Royal families were particularly obsessed with verification. The stakes were high if there was any chance of denying the marriage later. Political enemies would pounce. Think of the scandal if a queen gave birth and her child's legitimacy was in question. Wars could erupt over the suggestion that the heir was illegitimate. So these public beddings acted like physical signatures on a treaty, except the treaty was sealed with your body. Now, obviously, not everyone agreed this was the best way to do things. Even in the Middle Ages, there was pushback. Some clergy, especially the more pious ones, objected to the voyeuristic undertones of the bedding ceremony. A few even argued it was sinful to turn a sacred union into entertainment, but others defended it as necessary. Better a little discomfort now, they said, than legal and spiritual chaos later. There's still debate among historians about how widespread and literal these witness consummations were. Some argue the records exaggerate or that these were exceptional cases involving royals or controversial unions. Others believe they were common among the upper classes, especially in 13th to 15th century Northern Europe. Even if the exact methods differed, the core belief held. Marriages needed to be seen to be real. A wedding wasn't official without evidence of sexual union, and that evidence, preferably collected, documented, and blessed. Want a quirky side note to chew on? In some places, like parts of Brittany and Normandy, bedding ceremonies included a bed tax. Families had to pay the local lord for the right to consummate the marriage under his jurisdiction. This sometimes meant inviting said lord to the bedding ceremony itself, symbolically of course, though there are a few shady entries in the records that hint it wasn't always symbolic. If that doesn't scream romance, nothing does. And while we're on strange traditions, certain nobles like to gift special marriage sheets made from fine linens embroidered with family crests or religious symbols. These were intended to be stained and then displayed as a proof of the bride's virginity and the groom's prowess. If you think modern gift registries are awkward, imagine unwrapping your monogrammed, deflowering linens in front of your grandmother. Still, not all newlyweds took this lying down, pun somewhat intended. Some couples cleverly delayed the public bedding with excuses about superstition or bad omens. Others bribed attendants for privacy. There's even a documented case in 15th century Hungary where a noblewoman allegedly faked the entire ceremony with a paid stand-in. No word on whether anyone noticed. But for most, there was no escape. This night, this bed, and these watchers were part of a 1,000-year-old script. And while the candles burned low and the crowd thinned, the pressure didn't. The burden of proving yourself in that chamber, emotionally, physically, legally, was crushing. One night, one moment to confirm everything. Your value, your purity, your future as a spouse, and your role in the lineage. And as you lie beneath the heavy covers, pretending not to notice the muffled whispers beyond the door, you realize you've crossed an invisible threshold. Not just into marriage, but into surveillance. The performance may end, but the scrutiny? That stays. You would think, once the heavy chamber door finally clicks shut and the guests have either returned to their goblets or passed out on the rush-covered floors, that the ordeal is over. But nope, the real strangeness is just beginning. Because in this medieval world, the wedding night isn't just an intimate affair, it's a legal and social turning point, which means that what just happened, or didn't happen, will be talked about, debated, and even documented for years to come. And worse, there's a very real chance someone out there still doesn't believe you did it. That's where the witnesses in the wedding chamber come in, not just that early awkward crowd at the bedding ceremony, but those tasked with confirming that the couple actually completed the deed. Depending on where and when you are in medieval Europe, these could include close relatives, respected elders, court officials, or, in truly uncomfortable instances, the local clergy. Some stood nearby, just behind a heavy tapestry or curtain, pretending to be absorbed in prayer while listening for the telltale creaks of a mattress and perhaps, horrifyingly, other noises. And if you're really lucky, you're one of the newlyweds required to give a full verbal account of the act afterward. Yes, you get quizzed. Not a pop quiz, but something closer to an oral exam with serious consequences. Imagine sitting on a cold wooden bench, trying to explain to your mother-in-law, the priest, and a couple of sceptical aunts exactly what went where, for how long, and whether you were both in agreement about the result. Not to be too graphic, but terms like penetration, completion, and satisfaction of intent were common. Forget how was your night. This was describe your night in vivid legal terms while your dignity quietly combusts. In some regions, this questioning was done in private, in others it became semi-public. For royals, ambassadors might be informed, so foreign courts could update their records. This wasn't just gossip, it was state business. A future monarch might be conceived on that very night, after all, and people wanted receipts. Now let's talk about the sheet reveal. This wasn't just a plot device from some steamy historical drama. It happened. After the couple had supposedly consummated the marriage, a servant, often one who'd been strategically placed just outside the chamber, would enter and inspect the bed. Their task was to retrieve the linens, preferably stained with the bride's blood, to prove virginity. These sheets were sometimes displayed publicly the next morning, hanging from windows or carried through the courtyard in a bizarre little victory parade. Nothing says "we did it," like bloodied fabric flapping in the breeze while the cook claps enthusiastically. And heaven help the bride if the sheets were clean, because suddenly people weren't just whispering about your wedding, they were questioning your entire life. Were you a virgin? Were you faithful? Did you resist the consummation? Was your husband impotent? The suspicion often fell harder on the bride. Even if your husband had 2 left feet and the libido of a wet sponge, you were expected to make it work, and to bleed to prove it. Cue the awkward parade of theories. Maybe your hymen didn't break properly. Maybe you'd ridden too many horses. Maybe you were cursed, or a secret lover had already defiled you. A surprising number of these explanations made their way into official records too. Midwives and so-called wise women were sometimes brought in for post-wedding physical inspections. Imagine lying down while a woman you've never met mutters about your womb and checks for signs of tampering. Intimacy turned into investigation. Romance into forensics. The most elite weddings took things even further. In some Spanish and French courts, noble weddings required multiple witnesses to both the bedding and the next morning's inspection. There are reports of entire noble councils reviewing wedding night reports, nodding gravely like judges at a legal inquest. Some of these accounts were written down, lengthy descriptions full of poetic euphemisms and tortured metaphors, usually written by scribes who probably hated their job. Here's your fringe fact for this round. In parts of Eastern Europe there were traditions where the groom would emerge from the chamber carrying the bloodied sheet over his shoulder like a hunting trophy. He would then present it to the gathered guests as evidence of his masculine success and his bride's purity. Guests cheered, toasted, and some even kissed the sheet in congratulation. If you're thinking, okay, that's enough public bodily fluids for one lifetime, you're not alone. Scholars still argue about how much of this was routine and how much was symbolic theatre. Was the sheet always displayed? Probably not. Was it expected? Often, yes. In many cases, the mere suggestion that the deed was done, and that proof could be shown, was enough. But in political marriages, or when either family had something big to gain or lose, people wanted visual confirmation. Real, tangible, slightly damp proof. And when that proof didn't appear, things got messy. Denials of consummation could be grounds for annulment. Suddenly, the marriage everyone toasted at the feast was under threat, and the bride and groom could find themselves summoned before a church court to explain exactly why things hadn't gone according to plan. And yes, that explanation had to be explicit. There are even records of grooms claiming the bride resisted them, or that she used witchcraft to prevent arousal. On the flip side, some brides accused grooms of being incapable or uninterested. These cases were often incredibly detailed, with judges asking cringe-worthy follow-up questions. If you've ever lied to get out of gym class, imagine lying about your wedding night under oath, in Latin, while a bishop stares at you. It wasn't just about honour or tradition, it was about legal standing. An unconsummated marriage meant no binding contract. That meant no dowry, no inheritance, no alliance. Sometimes it even meant war. In one especially chaotic case from 14th century Scotland, a noble family refused to hand over land because their daughter's marriage hadn't been proven. The groom had to produce multiple witnesses and submit to a medical examination to prove he was, as the record puts it, capable of husbandly duties. Talk about pressure. So the next morning, even as you smile through breakfast, your performance from the night before is being quietly dissected. The servants whisper. The in-laws watch your every move. Did you limp a little? Did you blush at your husband's touch? Did you avoid eye contact with the bishop? Every detail is read like tea leaves in a very awkward fortune-telling session. Even after all that, you're not really free. The marriage is confirmed, sure, but the scrutiny lingers. People will count the months until your first child is born. They'll mark your fertility like a ledger, and if nothing happens within a year, the same questions resurface. Did they actually consummate the marriage? Or did they just fake the whole thing? Your bed may be empty now, the door locked, the room quiet, but the public still isn't done with your wedding night. Not even close. So here you are, finally past the awkward parade, the inspection-worthy bed linens, and the guests who loitered way too long at your bedside. You might think, now that the candles have melted into stubs and the music has faded down to one drunk uncle still singing in the courtyard, that the worst is over. But if you're wearing a crown or marrying into royalty, buckle up. Because in the royal world, your wedding night wasn't just a personal milestone. It was a matter of national interest, like a modern press conference, except you're naked and someone's praying it results in a baby 9 months from now. Or let's say you're a princess married off to a king or crown prince. Your dowry is massive, your dress was sewn by monks in 3 different countries, and your virginity is the backbone of an international treaty. Your entire value, politically speaking, hinges on whether your husband completes the mission tonight. That's why across medieval Europe, from the polished halls of French courts to the damp corridors of English castles, royalty routinely treated wedding night consummation like a group project with supervisors and checklists. Take, for example, the wedding of Margaret Tudor, sister of England's Henry VIII to James IV of Scotland. Historians suggest that high-ranking officials were present in the next room as the newlyweds consummated their marriage. Why? Because if anything went sideways later, say, if the bride's loyalty was questioned or the couple failed to produce an heir, no one could deny that the marriage had happened. There'd be records, names, observations, people who could swear, hand on a Bible, that the deed was done. And this wasn't a uniquely British pastime. Over in France, public bedding rituals among royals reached near theatrical levels. The king and queen would be walked to their chamber in a formal procession, robes trailing behind, candles in hand, while court officials flanked them like bodyguards of libido. Once in the room, attendants would undress them in full view of select witnesses, no really, and settle them into bed. Then a bishop might offer a prayer, and after that the entire group would wait, sometimes just outside the door, occasionally within eyesight, to ensure the new royal couple began their duties. One chronicler wrote of a queen nervously sipping wine in bed, while the Archbishop of Rouen stood just inside the doorway, quietly reading psalms. Nothing gets you in the mood like a full sermon about sin. Royal bedding rituals were also common in the Holy Roman Empire. In fact, the more powerful the families involved, the more elaborate the spectacle. In some cases, the consummation was followed immediately by a written statement signed by multiple noble witnesses and then sealed and stored in official archives. Think of it as a medieval certificate of, yes, this happened. And I saw it with my own extremely uncomfortable eyes. That document could later be used in court or cited during debates over succession. If a child was born with any questions of legitimacy, those few lines written after the wedding night became a powerful weapon. Not every monarch loved this setup. Some kings tried to wiggle out of it, citing modesty or preference for privacy, but privacy was considered suspicious. One particularly paranoid French king insisted on having no fewer than 12 witnesses. Why? Because he'd seen what happened when rival nobles claimed a wedding was invalid. He didn't want a civil war over whether or not he got lucky on his wedding night. And here's your fringe fact for this round. In 15th century Castile, there was a rumour, probably apocryphal but disturbing nonetheless, that the local clergy possessed a special mattress blessed for royal consummations. This holy bed was carted between noble households and was supposedly filled with relics of saints. You're lying there trying not to make eye contact with your new spouse, and somewhere beneath your backside is a finger bone from St. Cuthbert. Sleep tight. These royal rituals also reflected the deeply patriarchal obsession with legitimacy. A king's children had to be his, undeniably, provably his. And since paternity tests were centuries away, what you had was witnesses, blood-stained linens, and bureaucratic paperwork to make up the difference. This anxiety shaped everything. If a queen failed to become pregnant, her fidelity was questioned. If a king was impotent, it was often blamed on sorcery or divine punishment. There was no privacy in failure, just as there was none in success. Of course, the church had its fingerprints all over this tradition. They were the moral auditors of the monarchy, after all. Priests might bless the marriage bed, sprinkle holy water on the sheets, or recite prayers meant to encourage fertility. In some especially devout households, monks stood outside the chamber all night praying for conception. That's right, your sex life came with its own prayer vigil. Now, scholars do argue over how literal all of this was. Were witnesses actually staying in the room the whole time? Did they hear everything, or were they just making sure the couple got into bed and then giving them space? The answer, frustratingly, is all of the above. It depended on the court, the politics, and the level of trust between families. In some cases, it was mostly symbolic, a few minutes of ceremony followed by closed curtains and a silent nod. In others, it was much more involved, with scribes taking notes and counsellors waiting just outside to record the outcome. And if no child came of the union, you had better believe that wedding night would be rehashed in agonising detail. Were they alone too long? Was the bishop late with the blessing? Did they skip the fertility chant? Every part of the ceremony could be used later to prove that someone, usually the woman, had sabotaged the union, intentionally or not. So there you are, lying beneath royal silks, in a bed twice the size of your old room, with incense burning in the corner and a low murmur of voices outside the door. You don't know whether to cry or laugh. You're not sure what's more terrifying, the presence of watchers now or the fact that whatever happens in this room will be dissected for decades. The ink is already drying on the wedding record. The feast is being cleared away. But the pressure? That's just getting started. And somewhere, someone is already preparing a fresh set of linens, just in case the next night needs to be witnessed too. By now you might be wondering, did anyone enjoy these medieval wedding nights? Or were they all some twisted blend of performance art and psychological warfare? The answer is complicated. Because while much of what we've explored has the romantic charm of a root canal, there were times, strange raucous times, when the bedding ceremony was treated less like a trial and more like a party. That's right. In certain regions, at certain points in time, the whole thing was infused with revelry, jokes, and enough wine to make everyone forget how awkward it truly was. Welcome to the chaos of the bedding ceremony as entertainment. Picture it, the feast has dragged on for hours. Trenchers are piled high with bones, and the minstrels have started their fourth loop of green sleeves. People are drunk, stuffed, loud, and about 3 goblets past the point of caring about social niceties. That's when someone clinks a spoon against a cup and calls for the bedding procession. Immediately guests perk up, because this is the part where things get weird, and funny, and slightly disturbing. In many Northern European traditions, the bedding ceremony was as theatrical as it was intrusive. The guests would escort the newlyweds to their chamber, but not quietly and certainly not respectfully. This was more like a medieval hazing ritual. Along the way, guests sang crude songs, cracked increasingly inappropriate jokes, and sometimes physically shoved the bride and groom together, cheering like it was a sporting event. The path to the bed was a gauntlet of roast me humour and fertility-themed slapstick. Once in the chamber, the party didn't stop. Oh no, if anything, it got louder. The couple was expected to endure a few final humiliations before being allowed to, get on with it. In many places, they were undressed by the crowd. Not delicately. This was a tug-of-war between attendants, relatives, and opportunistic drunk friends, all pretending to help but absolutely making it worse. If you've ever had someone yank your boots off while singing a lute ballad, you might be a 14th century bride. At this point, the bride and groom, possibly half-dressed and entirely mortified, would be deposited into the bed. Sometimes alone, but often not. In fact, in Scottish and Germanic traditions, guests might climb onto the bed with them. Picture a bride pulling the covers up to her chin while her cousins jostle around her with mugs of ale, tossing peanuts and singing songs that rhyme maidenhead with newlywed. If it sounds chaotic, that's because it was. In fact, one English nobleman from the 15th century wrote in a private letter that his brother's bedding was a spectacle most unruly, with laughter, shrieking, and the lifting of skirts most indecent. Another chronicler described a wedding in Flanders where the groomsmen staged an impromptu play in the bedchamber, complete with props, costumes, and a satirical reenactment of what was about to happen under the sheets. The couple, according to the account, lay giggling beneath the coverlet, their faces crimson, while a man dressed as a bishop blessed a pillow. And here's your quirky footnote of the night. In parts of Scandinavia, it was traditional for guests to leave behind small tokens on the marriage bed. Not money or jewellery, eggs. Sometimes dozens of them, tucked under pillows or hidden in the sheets. Why? Symbolism, fertilities, new beginnings, and possibly a twisted sense of humour. Nothing says congrats on your union like rolling over onto a goose egg at midnight. But underneath all the merriment, there was still a layer of tension. Because even in the most laughter-filled ceremonies, the goal was the same, to encourage, pressure, or outright guarantee consummation. The performance might have been wrapped in songs and roasted almonds, but it still demanded proof. This wasn't just fun and games, it was obligation in costume. The guests weren't just being cheeky, they were helping to ensure there were no cold feet, no delayed unions, no annulment-worthy hesitations. And yet, despite all this, some couples leaned into the absurdity. There are accounts of newlyweds throwing back wine, laughing with their guests, and treating the whole thing like a strange rite of passage. After all, if you had no choice but to let half your village pile into your room and toss socks at your head while you're trying to get undressed, you might as well play along. Still, not everyone appreciated the spectacle. Some priests and moralists were horrified by the bedding ceremony's descent into farce. One 14th century monk in Saxony wrote a scathing sermon, titled On the Lecherous Dances of the Marriage Bed, in which he condemned the practice as blasphemous and indecent. He claimed that devils were present in such chambers and that drunken laughter chased away the angels meant to bless the union. To be fair, if your chamber's filled with people dressed as saints and pelting walnuts at your groin, he may have had a point. There was also regional variation in tone. In more pious Catholic regions, parts of Italy, Spain, or the Holy Roman Empire, the bedding ritual was often more subdued. Clerical blessing took precedence over comedy, and the idea of undressing in front of a crowd was considered scandalous, even dangerous. There the couple might be led to the bed with prayers and silence, and left alone with a simple directive, complete the sacrament. But in the north, especially in England, the Low Countries, and Scandinavia, rowdiness ruled. Marriage was a communal contract, and so was the act that sealed it. The community had a stake in your union. Children born of it would inherit land, carry family names, and work beside these very people. In that context, maybe it made sense for your neighbours to pile onto your mattress and shout encouragements like a medieval pep rally. So now, imagine yourself lying in bed, barely breathing under the covers while a dozen of your closest friends engage in a fertility chant that rhymes bed with dead. You're tipsy, embarrassed, and holding hands with someone you met just days ago. A lute is being played poorly in the corner, and someone's great aunt just tried to tuck you in while offering unsolicited tips about rhythmic harmony. You glance at your new spouse and realise you've both reached the same conclusion. This is either the worst night of your life or the strangest bonding experience you'll ever share. And then finally, as candles sputter and yawns replace laughter, the guests shuffle out. The chamber door closes, the rushes settle underfoot. You exhale, the real night can begin, and of course, tomorrow, everyone will be talking about it. Morning arrives too early, as it always does after a night like that. The sunlight sneaks in through the narrow stone slit of a window, slicing across the bed like a judgmental spotlight. You're stiff-sore, vaguely hungover, and painfully aware of the lingering smell of beeswax, sweat, and whatever smoked meat was served at hour 6 of the feast. The warmth of the sheets is deceptive, because the moment your feet hit the floor, reality sets in. This isn't just your first morning as a married person. This is the aftermath of a consummation spectacle. And just like any good medieval ritual, there's an encore, the morning review. It starts with whispers. The castle doesn't sleep, even when it pretends to. Servants pass by your door more frequently than usual, supposedly sweeping or carrying trays, but really listening for voices, movement, or lack thereof. If no one has exited the chamber by dawn, eyebrows rise. If the newlyweds appear too cheerful, or too awkward, that gets noticed too. The emotional forensic team is already at work and they don't need evidence. They run entirely on vibes, smirks, and a centuries-old instinct for bedroom gossip. But today, evidence is on the docket. Because in many households, especially among nobility, the wedding night's success had to be proven. Not just with blushing and giggles and "my husband is still asleep, heh heh." We're talking literal, visible proof. Specifically the bed sheets, hopefully stained. Hopefully in a way that says, this marriage is valid, and the bride was properly untouched before last night. Nothing like a little DNA-free medieval forensics to start your married life. This is where the bloodied sheet tradition comes in. As grim as it sounds, it was common practice to inspect the linens the morning after. A senior housekeeper, wet nurse, or trusted family matron might be invited or ordered into the chamber to retrieve the sheets. If they spotted blood, they'd nod solemnly, roll up the fabric like a sacred relic, and take it to the lord or lady of the house. The sheet would then be displayed in public view, hung from a window or draped over a banister for all to admire. Picture your intimate moment flapping gently in the breeze, surrounded by squinting peasants and a few proud relatives already arguing over baby names. Some went further. In regions like Burgundy and parts of Spain, nobles might invite guests to a formal breakfast under the stained sheet, literally hanging it like a banner above the dining table. Because nothing says bon appetit like bloodstains and symbolism. Wine was poured, toasts were made, and the family basked in the confirmation that their daughter or daughter-in-law had done her sacred duty. The whole thing had a grim sense of celebration, like a victory parade where the battlefield was your mattress. But what if the sheets were clean? Well, that's where things got tricky. If no visible blood was present, people didn't just shrug and assume a gentle experience. They speculated. Loudly. Was the bride a virgin at all? Was the groom able to perform? Did they even try? What if the couple fell asleep? What if they hated each other already? Suddenly, you're not a married couple. You're a courtroom case waiting to happen. In some families, a second attempt was arranged. Same guests, same ceremony, same crushing pressure. If that sounds like something out of a nightmare, you're not alone. But to a medieval mindset, well, the marriage wasn't finished until it was sealed with flesh and, ideally, blood. Without that, legal loopholes abounded. A clean sheet could spell annulment, family disgrace, and a heavy political blow, especially if the union was meant to secure a treaty or transfer land. Now, let's be clear, not every bloodless morning led to a scandal. Some families took the couple's word for it. Others looked for alternate signs, dishevelled hair, sleepy eyes, or servants reporting muffled laughter and movement from behind closed doors. In a few places, a pair of shoes left at the bedside was symbolic confirmation. But when trust was low or stakes were high, the absence of blood became a loaded silence. And into that silence rushed the suspicions of an entire court. Here's your fringe tale for the day. In 14th century Poland, one noble family, dissatisfied with the lack of blood on the wedding sheets, accused the bride of premarital impurity. Her family, outraged, staged an elaborate reenactment with a substitute bride, a goat bladder filled with red dye, and a confused groom who just wanted to eat his breakfast. The whole thing went poorly, involved a minor fire, and was later immortalised in local folklore as the Crimson Curtain debacle. Moral of the story? When you fake a bedding, make sure your props don't explode. Back to the real world. For most brides, especially those of lower nobility or wealthy merchant class, the morning review was stressful but survivable. You'd smile tightly, let the maid fold the sheets, and pray no one found reason to summon a priest. You'd endure the glances at breakfast, the nudges, the whispered questions. Did he hurt you? Was it quick? Did he seem pleased? All of which you'd answer with vague nods and a cup of warm cider you didn't ask for. And if you were the groom, well, congratulations. Your performance was equally under scrutiny. If you looked tired and triumphant, all was well. If you looked too perky, Too grumpy or too quiet, people talked. Some might even ask directly, was she intact? Did she seem experienced? Did you finish? These weren't taboo questions. They were practical ones because marriage at its core was about inheritance, and inheritance required clarity about legitimacy. There were even legal consequences tied to that first night. In cases where heirs were disputed years later, courts sometimes called on wedding night witnesses to testify. Not just that the marriage occurred, but that it was consummated, successfully. One woman in 15th century Brittany was forced to describe in court her wedding night to 3 separate judges, 20 years after the fact, because her son's claim to property was being challenged. She cried through the whole deposition. And let's not forget the servants. They saw everything. If they liked you, they covered for you. If they didn't, they might mention, casually while polishing silver, that no one heard anything from your chamber last night. That kind of gossip, once loosed, spread faster than plague in a summer port town. So here you sit, wrapped in a thick robe, chewing stale bread while a group of relatives debates whether to show the sheet or just let the mystery remain. Your spouse says little, sipping his drink like a man who's either satisfied or deeply overwhelmed. You exchange a glance. You both know what happened, or didn't. But it's no longer your story. It belongs to the household now. The wedding may be over, but the performance? Still running strong? Let's talk about virginity. Specifically, the medieval obsession with proving it. In a time when science was more alchemy than biology, and most people thought your body was governed by the balance of 4 mystical fluids, the idea of purity took on a life of its own. And nowhere was that more apparent than on the wedding night. You weren't just expected to show up, smile and play nice. You were expected to bleed. Loudly, obviously. Preferably on cue, because in this world, virginity wasn't just a personal trait. It was a legal, religious, and economic credential. Imagine your future, your marriage, your dowry. All of it hinging on one small invisible membrane that most medieval people didn't understand, but insisted on policing anyway. Welcome to the art and science, if you can call it that, of the medieval virginity test. Now, medieval thinkers weren't totally united on what virginity meant biologically, but they were absolutely certain it could be proven. Somehow. And they tried. Oh, did they try? First up were the so-called matrons of honour. Older women, often widows, appointed by noble families to inspect the bride before the wedding or immediately after the first night. Their job? Examine the bride for physical signs of virginity. Sometimes this meant checking for tightness or tenderness. Sometimes it meant looking for that elusive thing called the hymen, which, by the way, no one had seen with certainty, and yet everyone talked about like it was a well-known landmark. Let's be clear, none of this was scientific at all. It was folklore with a medical hat. Some believed virgin women had cooler breath. Others thought you could tell by checking the colour of their urine, or by seeing whether they winced when they coughed. There was even a belief in certain courts that a true virgin would have small, firm breasts and a certain clarity in the whites of her eyes. That's not a joke. That was testimony in court. And if these signs were missing, oh boy. That's when things escalated. A bride accused of lying about her virginity could find herself subjected to something more humiliating. The virginity trial. Usually held in a small private space, though private is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. These trials were overseen by midwives, sometimes accompanied by physicians, and in the most absurd cases, priests. The bride would be examined thoroughly, her reactions noted, her anatomy scrutinized for looseness or other reborn imagined clues. The goal was to confirm definitively whether or not she'd been spoiled. Spoiler alert, they couldn't, but that didn't stop them from trying. One particularly awful example comes from a 13th century case in Toulouse, where a noblewoman accused of not being a virgin had to undergo an internal examination by 3 midwives. They disagreed on their findings, which only made things worse. The court decided to bring in a local physician who, having no clue what he was looking for, declared that she seemed pure in spirit if not in body. That ambiguity led to a public scandal and annulment, and the woman being returned to her family in disgrace minus her dowry. Sometimes the bride wasn't even examined directly. Her sheets did the talking. Families, particularly those obsessed with reputation, would keep a piece of the blood-stained wedding sheet as a sort of certificate of virtue. It could be folded and stored, shown to relatives, or, in some cases, brought out during family disputes years later. Imagine arguing with your in-laws and someone pulls out a yellowing scrap of linen from a drawer like it's a trump card. Fringe fact time. In parts of rural Italy, there was a bizarre tradition where the bride's father or brothers would wait outside the chamber with a knife. If the groom emerged and claimed his bride hadn't been a virgin, they had the right, sometimes even the duty, to confront or challenge her. Occasionally this meant public shaming, occasionally it meant violence. Let that sink in. Your entire bodily history reduced to a game of he said she bleeds. Not surprisingly, women started getting creative. There are documented cases of brides using animal blood, most commonly from chickens or lambs, smeared discreetly on the sheets to simulate the expected proof. This wasn't done out of malice, but out of sheer self-preservation. The cost of being labelled unvirtuous was often total social ruin. For noble women, it meant being returned to your family in shame, possibly never married again. For commoners, it could mean being ostracised, punished by the church, or worse. And the fact that many women bled little or not at all during their first sexual experience, that didn't matter. The mythology was stronger than reality. There's one historical case from 15th century Bohemia where a woman brought her own sheet pre-stained in anticipation of being inspected. The plan worked, briefly, but her mother-in-law, suspicious of how red the stains were, allegedly too red to be natural, demanded a second night of bedding, this time with multiple witnesses. The bride fled the castle before sundown. She was later spotted working as a tavern maid in another province. No one knows what happened to the husband. And it wasn't just women under the microscope. In some courts, if the marriage wasn't consummated and the groom blamed his wife's lack of virginity, he might also be tested. More on that later. But for now, know that virginity was a political tool, and proving it was a ritual that mixed superstition, public shame, and a complete lack of biological understanding. The church played a confusing role here. On the one hand, it emphasized the purity of virginity as a spiritual ideal. On the other, it didn't really define how to prove it. Church courts would accept testimony, even gut feelings, over physical proof. If a bishop believed the couple had told the truth, that was often enough. But in secular courts, or among family elders, belief was shaky currency. They wanted evidence, bloody, humiliating, visible evidence. Even today, scholars debate how widespread these virginity tests were. Many they were the exception, more common in scandalous or high-stakes unions. Others think they were baked into the cultural fabric, especially in regions where marriages doubled as business deals. Either way, one thing is clear. The body, particularly the female body, was not your own. It was a ledger, and everyone wanted to audit it. So as you stand in the morning light dreading what the midwife or the mother-in-law might say, you understand the silent prayer that countless brides must have whispered, "Please let the proof be enough. Let them believe me, sir. Let me survive this. Let's say the sheets didn't convince anyone." Or maybe the bride's silence was interpreted as refusal, or perhaps the groom stumbled out of the chamber looking more embarrassed than victorious. Whatever the reason, something has gone wrong with the consummation. The whispering hasn't stopped. The bloodless linens have been quietly removed, or worse, displayed anyway, even though everyone knows they were mysteriously clean. And now the marriage is under scrutiny. Not just socially, but legally and spiritually. Which means the next step isn't just awkward, it's potentially devastating. Welcome to the part where your marriage bed becomes a courtroom exhibit, and your in-laws might call in exorcists or herbalists to fix what the wedding night broke. When consummation fails or stalls, the medieval world doesn't shrug and move on. No one says maybe they're just nervous or give them spo. Instead, they treat it like a breach of contract, a serious one. Because remember, marriage isn't primarily about love or compatibility. It's about alliance, property and babies. No consummation, no heirs, the future. So when a couple doesn't produce results right away, things escalate. Fast. First, there's the family intervention. You might be summoned to a private meeting with your new parents-in-law. There will be wine, probably, but it won't help. They'll ask pointed questions. Was your new spouse kind? Did they seem interested? Did anything happen? They'll say this with a half smile, but the tension is nuclear. If you're the bride, they'll want to know if you resisted. If you're the groom, they'll want to know if you're functional. Neither answer is safe. Either way, they're gathering information to determine what happens next. In some noble houses, this meant calling in a clerical figure, often a priest or monk with a reputation for matrimonial guidance. These men weren't therapists. They were spiritual troubleshooters. They'd question the couple separately, often asking for graphic details couched in theological phrasing. Did your body unite in sacred flesh? Did you fulfill the holy joining? That sort of thing. All while scribbling notes that might later be shared with the local bishop. If the couple insisted they tried but failed, things got even messier, because now the assumption wasn't that they wouldn't consummate, it was that they couldn't. And in a society obsessed with bodily function, that meant both physical and spiritual diagnoses. Was it impotence, a curse, possession, sin? For many, the answer was probably all of the above. Cue the folk remedies. A barrage of rituals and cures would be recommended, ranging from herbal tonics to outright sorcery. One popular belief was that a cursed womb or cold flesh could prevent successful consummation. Midwives might prescribe steaming baths infused with rosemary, cloves, or even powdered vulture heart. Yes, vulture. The idea was to heat the body, awaken desire, and prepare the womb. In some households, special fertility cakes were baked with herbs known for warming the blood, though several of these ingredients were dangerously toxic. But hey, no one ever said medieval foreplay was safe. For men, the solutions were equally absurd. Impotence wasn't just a personal problem, it was seen as a spiritual failing. Priests might advise fasting, prayer, or even self-flagellation to purify the soul and restore virility. Meanwhile, apothecaries would offer powdered antler, dried beef, thorax, or even snake meat to restore the member's boldness. The logic behind this? Don't look for it. It's not there. Let's sprinkle in your fringe fact. In 14th century Provence, there was a travelling marriage fixer known as Isabeau of Arles. She wasn't a doctor, she wasn't a midwife, she was by all accounts a loud and terrifying woman who claimed she could solve consummation issues through a combination of shouting, massage, and peppered wine. One chronicle describes her grabbing a reluctant groom by the wrist, dragging him into the room and slamming the door. 15 minutes later there was banging, then silence, and finally Isabeau emerged with a bloodied sheet and a wink. Whether it was legitimate or staged, no one ever dared ask. Still, not every intervention was theatrical. Sometimes the couple would simply be given more time, under observation of course. They'd be allowed to try again, maybe with fewer watchers, maybe with calming herbal tonics, maybe with a different mattress. Yes, some believe bedding material could affect fertility. These do-over attempts were just as high pressure. Failure again meant escalating consequences. At this point, legal options started entering the conversation. Families, particularly powerful or wealthy ones, might petition for annulment. The claim, non-consummation. And this wasn't just hearsay. To get a marriage annulled, you had to prove that consummation had not occurred and would not occur. This meant more witnesses, more questioning, and in some cases, full-blown trials. Church courts handled these cases with chilling seriousness. Couples would be summoned to testify separately. Each would be asked a series of humiliating, often invasive questions. Have you attempted copulation? Did the man's member enter the woman's vessel? Was there a mission? If you're blushing just reading that, imagine having to say it in front of 4 grim-faced clerics while your neighbour's cousin translates your dialect into Latin. Sometimes physical exams were ordered. That's right, medieval sex courts weren't shy about dragging physicians into the bedroom, sometimes literally. If the groom claimed he couldn't consummate due to medical issues, he might be examined for natural ability. If the bride was accused of hiding prior intimacy or resisting, she could be inspected for signs of trauma, obstruction, or anatomical irregularities. Again, we're talking pre-microscope, pre-anesthesia, pre-consent medicine. Brutal doesn't even begin to cover it. Now here's the scholarly debate. Some historians argue that these trials were rare, exaggerated in the records, and mostly reserved for high-stakes noble marriages. Others believe they were more common than we like to admit, especially in regions where the church had strong control over marriage law. Either way, the fact that these processes existed at all tells you everything you need to know about how marriage, intimacy, and control were tangled together in medieval life. And all of this, it circles back to that first night, that one moment behind closed doors when 2 people, possibly stranger-biz, were expected to make a union that would bind families, secure lands, and please both heaven and earth. One awkward fumble, one moment of hesitation, and suddenly your life becomes a case file. So you can imagine the pressure. You're no longer just lying in bed with your spouse. You're lying under centuries of expectation, legal scrutiny, and spiritual doom. And if the marriage goes unconsummated, you won't just face judgment from your partner or your priest, you'll face it from the entire world. By now, you've endured the wedding, the bedding, the awkward congratulations, the morning after gossip, and maybe even a few pointed questions from someone who shouldn't have been anywhere near your chamber in the first place. But let's say things didn't go smoothly. Maybe there was no blood, maybe there was hesitation, or maybe someone, your spouse, your in-laws, or a nosy cousin who just really likes drama, claims the marriage wasn't truly consummated, and when words aren't enough and whispers won't do, you're dragged into the most uncomfortable place of all, the public trial. Yes, actual court cases. Trials about whether two people really had sex. Welcome to the consummation inquest, medieval specialty as absurd as it is horrifying. The marriage might be weeks or even months old, but if the right people say the wrong things, suddenly you're sitting before a panel of clerics, nobles, or judges, being asked to describe your first night in excruciating detail, while someone takes notes. Now, you might think the burden of proof would fall equally on both spouses, but you'd be wrong. Typically, the woman bore more scrutiny, her body, her virginity status, her willingness. But if the man was accused of impotentia coeundi, inability to perform the sexual act, he wasn't off the hook. Quite the opposite. He might be summoned to prove his virility in court. And no, not with a doctor's note or a heartfelt monologue. In some cases, he had to do it. There. Picture this. A wooden chamber, a panel of judges in long robes, and a slightly damp cleric asking you to demonstrate capacity by physically arousing yourself behind a screen. That's not fiction. In at least a dozen recorded cases across France and Italy, men were required to prove they could become erect in front of appointed witnesses. If they failed, due to stress, embarrassment, or, the entire situation, they could be declared impotent. And impotence, in the eyes of the church, meant the marriage was invalid. Even more uncomfortably, the woman might be asked to describe her husband's failure in graphic detail. Was he unable to complete the act? Was he soft of member? Could he not enter the vessel, as the Latin record so delicately put it? Some wives got graphic, some were vague, others simply cried their way through it. Regardless, it was all written down and filed away in church archives, because nothing says sacred union like a bureaucratic sex audit. These weren't quick hearings, either. They dragged on for weeks. Both sides were allowed to call witnesses, that's right, witnesses, servants who worked in the home, family members who heard things, midwives who inspected the bride, gossip mongers who insisted they'd seen the couple sleeping apart. All of them could be summoned to testify under oath about whether a certain couple had fulfilled their conjugal debt. One case from 15th century Verona involved a young bride who claimed her wealthy merchant husband had never consummated the marriage, despite repeated attempts. He denied this, saying she was lying to escape the union. The court ordered the couple to undergo 3 nights of observation, meaning they were placed in a private chamber with a panel of female attendants stationed outside the door. The idea was to give the husband a fair chance, but also to catch him in a lie. On the 3rd night, the attendants heard nothing. The marriage was annulled, the dowry returned, and the husband's reputation never quite recovered. He later moved to Milan where, according to legend, he sold dried fruit and avoided all eye contact forever. Sometimes trials didn't end in annulment. In more sympathetic cases, the church might order the couple to undergo marital counselling. In theory, this meant gentle guidance and support. In reality, it often meant a priest or monk sitting the couple down, quoting scripture about fruitful unions, and giving what can only be described as an extremely awkward sermon on missionary position. There's even a record from a small abbey in Brittany where the local abbot instructed the couple to bathe together in sanctified water to cleanse their minds and bodies. The couple promptly faked a miraculous recovery and were never seen in the chapel again. But the truly terrifying outcomes? Those involved forced consummation. In rare, but not unheard of situations, especially when land, money, or political alliance was at stake, couples were ordered to try again under direct supervision. This didn't always mean an actual audience, though it sometimes did, but it often meant being locked in a chamber overnight with multiple chaperones stationed just outside. The next morning the sheets would be inspected, the couple interrogated, and if necessary, a second night would be arranged. Here's your unsettling fringe detail. In some regions of Germany, an old superstition claimed that marriages which remained unconsummated for more than a month would invite demonic interference. The couple could be cursed, the livestock would wither, and their crops might fail. To combat this, families hired local folk healers to bless the bed with herbs, incantations, and, in one documented case, the strategically placed skull of a mouse. Because nothing inspires intimacy like a dead rodent tucked beneath the headboard. What's even more bizarre is that some couples willingly participated in these trials. Not everyone was miserable about it. A few women used the opportunity to escape terrible marriages. If a groom was cruel or negligent, a bride might fake hesitation, then claim failure. If the court believed her, and many did, she could walk away, sometimes with her dowry, her dignity, and a fresh chance at remarriage. The system was flawed, brutal, and laced with misogyny, but it occasionally worked in unexpected ways. Scholars today still dig through dusty ecclesiastical court records, trying to figure out how common these cases really were. Some think they were rare, exaggerated by chroniclers who loved scandal. Others believe they were routine, quiet mechanisms to regulate society when the bedroom became a battlefield. But one thing's certain. If your marriage went to trial, your body wasn't your own. It belonged to the judges, the record keepers, the curious community, and of course your legacy. So you sit in the witness chair, hands clenched, eyes low, describing the most private part of your life in front of men who've never once considered what it feels like to be paraded and probed for political closure. You answer their questions, you endure their frowns, and when the hearing ends, you're told to wait. They'll decide if you're really married. You know, later, after lunch. Let's pretend just for a moment that the court didn't get involved. Maybe there was no scandal, and maybe the blood on the sheets passed inspection, even if it came from a suspiciously helpful chicken. Maybe the priest gave a quiet nod, the mother-in-law stopped peeking through the keyhole, and you and your spouse were finally left alone to figure things out like actual humans. Sounds like peace, right? Well, only if your bodies cooperate. Because what no one wants to talk about, not loudly anyway, is that medieval couples, newly married or not, often faced real, frustrating, and deeply misunderstood issues in the bedroom. And that's where things got experimental. Welcome to the strange world of medieval bedroom medicine, a genre of health advice best described as a mix between early science, superstition, and someone throwing herbs at a problem and praying it fixed itself. If your wedding night fizzled out, not because of lack of trying, but due to, let's say, technical complications, you weren't left to figure it out in private. There were remedies. There were tonics. There were treatments passed down by village midwives, foreign doctors, monks with too much time on their hands, and that one aunt who always swore she had a recipe that worked every time. Let's start with the men, since their performance, or lack thereof, could make or break the entire union. Medieval medicine often boiled male sexuality down to one simple idea: heat. A strong man was hot, literally. His blood ran warm, his body firm, his member ever ready. If he was too cold, desire and performance suffered. So how do you heat a man up? Glad you asked. The most common remedy was a concoction of aphrodisiac herbs, usually ground into wine or made into pastes. Goat liver was a big one, believed to boost blood and fire. Ant eggs, yes, real ants, were another. A handful of powdered ants stirred into mulled wine was said to stoke desire. You can imagine how that tasted. Other recommendations included cinnamon, mustard seeds, and ginger, all heating agents believed to increase circulation and revive the sleeping serpent, as one monk poetically described it. And then there were the more enthusiastic options. One German apothecary claimed that a poultice of crushed leeks and bear fat applied directly to the genitals restored vigour within the hour. No record of how often that caused screaming. Some men turned to more extreme measures. Heated stones wrapped in cloth were pressed to the thighs or lower abdomen to ignite the belly furnace. There are even records of men using iron rods warmed by fire and held near, though hopefully not too near, the groin. Needless to say, this had some mixed results. One noble in Milan reportedly tried this method and then couldn't walk for 3 days. The records do not say whether the marriage survived. But it wasn't all on the men. Women too were expected to be ready and willing. And if they weren't, well, clearly something needed fixing. Female sexual health was even more poorly understood, which is saying a lot. The prevailing idea was that women, like men, did heat to become aroused, but they also had to be moistened, either by natural humours or external help. If she was dry, the union would be painful, even impossible, and could be interpreted as a divine rejection of the marriage. Midwives and herbalists stepped in with a range of solutions. Oils infused with chamomile, cloves and warming roots were applied by hand or with cloths. One particularly popular potion included wild thyme, fennel, and a touch of honey, boiled into a thick paste and rubbed into the lower back and thighs. Supposedly this loosened the gate, as one midwife helpfully explained. Of course, this also attracted bees if not washed properly, which led to a completely different set of problems. And then there were love charms, not potions, charms. Enchanted tokens, whispered prayers, and small talismans worn during intimacy. A piece of red coral tied around the thigh, a silver coin warmed in the fire and placed under the mattress. One French custom involved tying the tail of a lizard to a string and placing it beneath the bed. It should still be twitching, the instructions said. Nothing like starting your romantic evening with reptilians squirming underfoot. But perhaps the most ridiculous cure came from a 15th century English herbal known as the Lyon Physic Book. According to this medical masterpiece, a surefire way to revive desire was to boil sparrow brains in milk, mix it with crushed almonds, and drink it while reciting Psalm 45 3 times. It's unclear whether this worked, or whether everyone involved simply got distracted by how gross it was and forgot why they were doing it. All these efforts, of course, were fueled by panic, because failure to consummate wasn't just embarrassing, it could lead to annulment, disgrace, or worse. Families might start sniffing around, demanding to know what was being done to remedy the issue. Servants would gossip. And worst of all, the church might get involved. Some clerics offered surprisingly detailed advice for rekindling passion. Begin with mutual words of kindness, one abbot wrote. Then place thy hands gently upon her belly and proceed with firmness, but not haste. Reading that out loud probably caused more blushes than help. Here's a curious fact. In several noble households, couples kept what were known as intimacy journals. Not personal diaries, official logs kept by stewards or housekeepers detailing whether the marriage had been visited each night. If a week went by without mention of intimacy, someone, usually the bride's family, would politely ask for an update. Can you imagine a steward knocking on your door during breakfast and inquiring whether last night's attempt bore fruit? Because that absolutely happened. Still, not every attempt to fix things came from outside. Some couples actually grew closer while trying to solve their difficulties. They learned together, they experimented in secret, and occasionally the pressures faded just enough for something resembling affection, or at least cooperation, to bloom. In a world where your wedding was arranged, your body a public interest, and your performance tracked like a tournament score, even a little mutual understanding felt like a small rebellion. So now you're sipping a potion made of hawthorn and cloves, your spouse is rubbing mysterious oil into his elbows, and there's a rabbit skull dangling from the bedpost that neither of you placed there. Outside, the castle bustles with people assuming you're doing just fine. Inside, you're figuring it out. Clumsily, quietly, one weird folk remedy at a time. And maybe, just maybe, you don't hate each other. You'd think, after all that, the potions, the lizard tails, the prayer-soaked wine, and dignity-devouring trials, that people might accept a simple truth. Sometimes it just doesn't work out. But not in the Middle Ages. No. When a marriage fell apart due to failure in the bedroom, it wasn't just tragic or unfortunate, it was grounds for annulment. And the most powerful and humiliating legal path to that was proving that the groom couldn't perform. Yes, we're heading straight into the world of impotence trials, where medieval men were forced to prove their sexual ability in front of witnesses, sometimes with their pants off, because nothing says high court procedure like a limp royal member and 3 bishops holding candles. Let's set the stage. You're a noblewoman, young, married for months, and no baby in sight. No blood on the wedding sheets, no laughter in the bedchamber. Maybe your husband blames you, claiming you're cold or unwilling. Or maybe you're sick of pretending that everything's fine when your marriage is, quite literally, going nowhere. You want out. So you do the only thing the law allows. You claim non-consummation. And not just lack of opportunity, you claim physical impossibility. Your husband, you allege, is impotent. Cue the legal fireworks. The court steps in, but it's not enough for you to say he couldn't perform. No, you have to prove it. Or, more specifically, he has to fail to prove otherwise. That's where the ordeal begins. The husband is summoned to appear before a clerical court where he is required to defend his honour, his body, and his, let's be honest, entire masculinity. And the most absurd part? He doesn't get to do it in private. There are procedures, witnesses, sometimes doctors, other times midwives, occasionally both. Because why not double the audience? The court might order a physical inspection, yes, an actual examination of the man's genitals. They'd check for deformities, disease, or insufficient stiffness. Keep in mind, this is before antibiotics, before privacy laws, and before anyone had any real understanding of human anatomy beyond hot blood is good. These inspections often took place in cold stone chambers, with a few elderly monks murmuring Latin while staring at the poor guy's undercarriage. It's a miracle anyone passed, but it didn't stop at physical appearance. In the most notorious cases, the man had to demonstrate arousal, right there, sometimes behind a curtain, sometimes in front of a witness. There are documented trials where the defendant was given erotic materials, woodcuts, poems, or in one bizarre case, a recitation of Ovid's The Art of Love to help things along. One unfortunate knight was told to think lustful through all the thoughts and stir the blood. When that failed, the court asked whether he'd like his wife to come in and assist. He declined, loudly. If he failed to perform, the court would declare him impotent de jure and the marriage would be annulled. This wasn't just embarrassing, it could ruin reputations, cost inheritances, and end careers, especially among nobles, where virility was tied to leadership, strength, and divine favour. A failed man might as well hang up his sword. He'd be laughed out of court, sometimes literally, and sent home with his head down and his estates suddenly in dispute. But here's where it gets even murkier. Not all impotence was physical. Sometimes it was claimed to be magical. That's right. Medieval law recognised the idea of sorcery-induced impotence. A jilted ex, a jealous rival, or even a spiteful neighbour could, allegedly, curse a man's loins, rendering him unable to perform. This was sometimes referred to as maleficium of the member, and yes, it was taken seriously. The accused might be ordered to seek a blessing, drink holy water, or wear a relic near the affected area, usually a tiny cross or a scrap of saintly bone tied to the thigh. And of course some men leaned into this defence. After all, it was better to claim you were bewitched than to admit, say, that you were deeply anxious, uninterested in your wife, or just not into the whole arranged marriage thing. There's a case from 14th century Florence where a merchant blamed his failure on a spell cast by a baker's daughter he'd refused to marry. She, in turn, said she only baked loaves, not curses. The court was unconvinced, but ruled the marriage invalid anyway. Fringe fact of the night. In some German-speaking regions, there were rituals designed to break impotence curses. One method involved dragging the naked groom through a field at dawn while chanting psalms backwards. Another required him to jump over a burning haystack completely nude while holding a live rooster. The rooster didn't survive. The marriage didn't either. Now, before you start feeling too bad for the men, keep in mind that women had no comparable path. A woman who couldn't perform, whether due to trauma, fear, or medical conditions, was usually accused of disobedience or frigidity. No court offered her an annulment unless her body showed clear signs of closure, often determined by invasive and degrading examinations. The imbalance in agency was staggering. Men were pitied or excused. Women were blamed, punished, or sent home broken. Still, a few clever women used the impotence trial as a weapon. A bride stuck in a loveless, abusive, or dangerous marriage could publicly claim that her husband was unable. If he refused the inspection, he lost the case. If he failed it, same outcome. If he passed, well, things got awkward, but at least she had stirred scandal. A noblewoman in 15th century Navarre famously accused her husband of impotentia not once, but 3 separate times across 5 years. Each time the husband passed the inspection but failed to impregnate her. Eventually the court ruled that their incompatibility was divine punishment and allowed the annulment. She married a knight 3 months later. He kept his pants on. Modern scholars debate just how common these trials were. Some argue they were rare, dramatic exceptions. Others think the church courts saw more of these cases than anyone liked to admit, and only recorded the most theatrical ones. Either way, they reveal a world where your body was never just yours. It was a political tool, a spiritual test, and occasionally a court exhibit. So now you're standing in a cold room, a bishop on your left, a physician on your right, and someone holding up a curtain for what they're calling privacy. Your wife is outside praying this works, or doesn't. And you've never wished harder to disappear into thin air. Whether you rise to the occasion or not, one thing is certain. Someone, somewhere, is taking notes. If there's one group you might not expect to be involved in the intimate failures of your medieval marriage, it's the clergy. You'd hope they'd be busy with, prayers, penance, exorcisms, and supervising people not murdering each other over stolen sheep. But no, when it came to consummation problems, the church didn't just poke its head in. It walked through the front door, plopped down beside the bed, and offered unsolicited advice about technique. Welcome to the priestly role in medieval bedroom woes, where performance anxiety met divine intervention, and your wedding night became a sort of holy group project. Let's say your marriage is in trouble, no heirs, no signs of intimacy. Maybe you're the groom and things aren't happening the way they should. Or maybe you're the bride and your husband turns pale every time you remove a hairpin. Whatever the reason, your confessor eventually hears about it. He may have been tipped off by your spouse, or your parents, or the cook. Either way, he shows up at your doorstep not to perform last rites, but to offer something worse, marriage counsel. The church, especially during the High and Late Middle Ages, considered marriage both a legal contract and a sacred sacrament. That meant sex wasn't just allowed, it was required. Procreative marital sex was considered holy, even spiritually beneficial. So when it wasn't happening, it wasn't just a private problem, it was a spiritual crisis. The solution? Religious coaching offered with all the tact and nuance of a monk armed with a sermon scroll and no personal experience. Priests weren't shy about getting involved. In fact, some clerics wrote extensive guides on how to remedy intimacy issues, filled with everything from spiritual meditations to highly detailed physical suggestions. One 13th century manual by a French bishop includes a chapter titled On Proper Conduct in the Marital Bed, where couples are advised to begin with prayer, then proceed slowly, with the man taking care not to disturb her modesty too abruptly. It recommends dim lighting, gentle speech, and avoiding the animal passions that lead one into base acts. If that sounds more like a monk's theory of spooning than actual advice, you're not wrong, but that's not all. Priests sometimes met with couples individually to discuss the nature of their physical relationship, and by discuss I mean interrogate. Have you lain together? Did he place his member in the proper place? Did the act conclude with a mission? The questions were clinical, borderline creepy, and always documented. This wasn't pastoral care, this was spiritual regulation of your genitals. If the problem was believed to be moral, say the couple was too proud, too lustful, or too indifferent, penance was prescribed. Confession, fasting, abstinence from meat or wine, and even pilgrimages were recommended to clear the soul before intimacy resumed. One especially dramatic abbot in Normandy advised a noble couple to walk barefoot to the local cathedral and kneel in separate pews for 30 days before attempting sex again. They did it, and unsurprisingly nothing improved. But the more uncomfortable cases were the ones where priests offered, let's call it practical advice. In monasteries across Europe, some monks wrote letters to noble couples explaining not just what to do, but how to do it. Gently, dutifully, missionary position only. Of course, anything else was sinful even if you were married. There are even stories of priests offering verbal step-by-step instructions through the chamber door. Imagine you're already sweating from nerves and Father Gregory is outside saying, "Now place thyself upon her gently, with thoughts only of the Lord." That brings us to the question of positions. The church had a lot to say about them. The natural position, as they called it, was man on top, face-to-face, silent, and strictly for reproduction. Anything else, standing, sitting, kneeling, or heaven forbid from behind, was labelled the sin of Sodom. Yes, that's right. Your favourite experimental moment? According to some clerics, it meant eternal damnation. Even talking too much during sex was discouraged. Passionate moaning, demonic, excessive kissing, carnal weakness. Eye contact was fine, as long as it was serious. And what if the problem wasn't physical at all? What if your spouse just didn't want to sleep with you? Well, the church had opinions on that too. Refusal to consummate without a valid reason was considered a sin. Spouses were owed sex under canon law. The Latin term was debitum conjugale, meaning marital debt. If your partner wasn't paying up, you had grounds to complain to your confessor, and in some cases, escalate it to church court. Yes, you could legally demand your marital rights. Of course, this created a massive double standard. A wife refusing her husband could be shamed, punished, or labelled disobedient. But if a husband refused her, the priest might frown, sigh, and encourage him to reflect on his duties, but the enforcement was softer, unless the couple was childless after many years, in which case everyone panicked and the bishop got involved. Here's your fringe fact. In some religious communities, monks were trained in matrimonial counsel and deployed to noble households like spiritual sex therapists. They carried manuals, holy water, and no joke, a small cloth bag of blessed herbs to place beneath the bed for purity. One such monk in 14th century Austria reportedly slept outside the couple's chamber for 3 nights, reciting psalms to cleanse the space while they tried to, as he put it, rekindle sacred union. What the couple actually did inside is lost to history, but the monk later wrote that he felt a divine peace and thumping of joy. This all ties back to the medieval church's awkward paradox. Sex was holy but dangerous, necessary but only when done correctly. Too much pleasure was suspicious, too little was a problem. You had to walk a tightrope between piety and productivity, between duty and desire, and if you slipped, someone in robes would be knocking at your door. Scholars continue to debate how common these priestly interventions were. Some argue that the records exaggerate. After all, monks were prone to moral drama. Others say it was regular practice among upper-class families and clergy-dominated towns, especially when a marriage appeared to be failing. Either way, the idea of an unmarried, celibate man lecturing a married couple about physical intimacy tells you everything you need to know about medieval logic. So now you're sitting at the end of the bed, wrapped in a woolen robe, your spouse beside you looking like they'd rather fight a bear, while a priest slowly reads from a scroll about marital harmony and gentle intention. There's a faint smell of incense. Someone left a blessed candle in your soup, and your privacy, long gone. But hey, at least you've been absolved. Whether or not that helps in the bedroom remains to be seen. It's a new night. The fire crackles in the hearth. The wedding guests are long gone, or at least drunk enough to stop banging on pipes and singing fertility ballads 2 floors below. You're back in the bedchamber, dim candlelight flickering against old stone walls, and at last, you and your new spouse are alone, just the 2 of you. No priests, no meddling relatives, no court officials lingering outside the door with their ears pressed to the wood like perverted detectives. But before you relax too much, you notice a movement near the curtain, a whisper, a cough that wasn't yours, because even now, in this supposedly private moment, you're not really alone. Welcome to the not-so-secret presence of the night watch, maids, servants, chaperones and chamberlains who lurk just beyond the velvet hangings, pretending to mind their own business while being very much in your business. In the medieval world, intimacy might have been expected, but privacy? That was a luxury few married couples actually received. Let's rewind for a moment. The bedding ceremony is over, the guests did their cheering, the priest muttered a prayer over the bed, and someone probably spilled wine on your one nice set of linens. But even after all that, the expectation wasn't that you'd be given time to figure out this whole sex thing at your own pace. Instead, attendants would often remain in the chamber, standing behind tapestries, lounging near the fire, or awkwardly dozing in a nearby chair. Their presence wasn't incidental, it was intentional. They were there to observe, to record, to confirm, and sometimes to help. Let's take a second to process that last bit. Help. Not in the obvious way, though there are a few disturbing exceptions, but in the logistical sense. A chambermaid might remove your underclothes while whispering advice. A steward could offer a polite cough if things got too quiet. A senior nursemaid might explain in a hushed voice how to avoid conception, or how to ensure it. The newlyweds were often young, inexperienced and terrified. So naturally, the solution was to add more people to the room and hope that somehow made it easier. This wasn't just some noble family quirk either. It was the norm in many parts of medieval Europe. Royal couples almost never spent their wedding night truly alone. Even among the lesser nobility, it was common to have servants stationed nearby, not just to light candles or fetch water, but to witness. The bedding wasn't over until someone could report that the couple had entered the bed, shared a kiss, or at the very least laid side by side under the same blanket for a reasonable amount of time. In one English case from the 15th century, the bride's lady-in-waiting was tasked with sitting in a chair by the bed until sleep took them both. She wrote in her personal journal that she pretended to nap while listening carefully for the gentle rustling of garments and the sighs of honest labour. If that sounds like a Victorian romance novel gone terribly wrong, well, it was. And the servants weren't always passive. In some castles, maids were trained to read the mood of the couple. If things weren't progressing quickly enough, a well-placed compliment, "You look so strong, milady," might be dropped into conversation. If the bride appeared hesitant, a nurse might reassure her by holding her hand and reciting a prayer of marital peace. If the groom seemed nervous, he might be offered a goblet of heart wine, a mildly spiced drink laced with herbs known for their, let's say, stimulatory effects. In other words, servants became part of the script. They played their roles like stagehands in a very awkward play, adjusting the lighting, fluffing the pillows, and occasionally pretending not to notice anything at all. Their discretion, or lack of it, could make or break a marriage's reputation. A maid who reported a successful night could earn favour for life. One who gossiped about failure might be dismissed, or, more darkly, threatened into silence. Of course, not every couple accepted this intrusion. Some refused to undress with attendants present. Others dismissed their staff entirely, only to be met with scandal the next day. What are they hiding? People would ask. Why the secrecy? In a society where everything was communal, especially your bedroom, privacy was often read as guilt. The assumption was, if you had nothing to be ashamed of, you wouldn't mind a few eyes and ears nearby. And this culture of constant presence wasn't just a noble issue. Among commoners, the same ideas held, just with less embroidery. In a village, the house might be so small that your parents slept in the same room, or the neighbours would be waiting outside to ask about your night over morning ale. Servants weren't professional witnesses, but they were still part of the narrative. A creaky bed frame or muffled giggle through thin walls could become the stuff of village legend by sunrise. Here's your offbeat tidbit. In some parts of medieval Scandinavia, it was traditional for the bridesmaids to sleep in the same bed as the couple on the wedding night. Not to participate, let's not get it that weird, but to ward off evil spirits and ensure good fertility. The idea was that a crowd made for a protective buffer against supernatural sabotage. Of course, you can imagine how this affected the mood. There's at least one saga in which the groom gives up entirely, mutters something about Odin's lack of mercy, and goes out to sleep in the barn. And then there's the question of who actually benefited from this awkward surveillance. Not the couple, certainly, but for families, having a trusted servant or maid witness the early days of a marriage gave them leverage. A bride's family might ask for nightly updates. The groom's household could keep an eye on his loyalty, or on whether he was sneaking off to someone else's chamber. The bedroom became a political observation deck, staffed by people whose loyalty was often bought and paid for. The scholarly debate here is whether these attendants always stayed the whole night or left once the couple was undressed and tucked in. The truth is murky. In some courts, it's clear the servants lingered until enough had occurred. In others, they stood just outside, pretending not to listen while doing exactly that. Either way, what we consider basic privacy simply didn't exist. So now, imagine trying to connect with your new spouse, already a stranger, already under enormous pressure, while someone irons your nightshirt 10 feet away, or worse, sits politely knitting as if the room isn't heavy with tension and expectation. You shift under the covers, you glance toward the curtain, you whisper something you hope no one hears, but the walls have ears, the bed has witnesses, and tomorrow, so does everyone else. At this point in our medieval honeymoon horror show, you might be thinking, well, at least the peasants were spared. Surely commoners, living in thatched roof cottages with no titles or treaties at stake, got to bypass the whole parade of witnesses, legal sex trials, and hovering priests, right? Not exactly. The truth is, while the rituals of the upper class were more elaborate and better documented, the average medieval villager wasn't exactly slipping into bed unnoticed either. In fact, for commoners, the pressure to perform may have been even more relentless, just in different, equally nosy ways. Let's drop you into a peasant wedding in, say, 13th century England. You've just tied the knot, likely in a modest church or out in the village square. You're wearing your one decent tunic. There was a small feast, some bread, a few chickens, enough ale to guarantee at least 2 uncles fell asleep in a ditch. There's laughter, rough music, and absolutely no space to be alone. Because you probably live in a one-room cottage, with your parents, and possibly a goat. Privacy? Still a myth. Now, in the world of commoners, the consummation wasn't always surrounded by clergy and official witnesses, but it was public knowledge. Everyone knew when it was supposed to happen. Everyone wanted to know if it did. The entire village had a vested interest in your reproductive success. Not because they were weird, okay, maybe a little, but because your family's future workforce depended on it. Children meant more hands for the fields, more bodies for the household, more continuity for the local economy. Fertility wasn't private, it was communal business, and so peasants had their own version of the bedding ceremony. It may not have involved silk sheets or golden goblets, but it definitely came with singing, dragging, teasing, and sometimes a full-blown procession. In parts of Wales and Scotland, the villagers would literally carry the bride and groom to bed, often on a cart, wheelbarrow, or even a borrowed ox sled, accompanied by song, drumbeats, and endless jokes. Think of it as the rowdy, mud-spattered version of the royal walk to the chamber. Once delivered, the newlyweds might be expected to share a drink, sometimes honey mead, sometimes whatever ale was still left standing. The crowd would shout encouragements. If you were lucky, they closed the door. If you weren't, they stayed just outside, listening. And afterward, same deal as the nobles. People expected a sign. Maybe not blood-stained linens, but some sort of confirmation. A dishevelled appearance, a delayed emergence, a satisfied grin, something to prove you weren't wasting everyone's time. And if that proof wasn't obvious, oh, they talked. Rumours in the village spread faster than fire in a hayloft. A bride who didn't blush the next morning was labelled cold. A groom who emerged looking too well rested might be mocked for weeks. One cobbler in northern France was nicknamed Limp Lance for the rest of his life after his bride complained publicly that he had fallen asleep during their wedding salad. She later remarried. He kept fixing shoes in silent shame. But it wasn't all jeering and gossip. In some areas, older women in the village acted as informal sex mentors. They'd offer advice to the bride before the wedding night, some practical, some wildly inaccurate. There were tips like, rub salt on your feet to keep your husband faithful, or don't eat fish before lying with your man or your womb will grow scales. Still, the intention was to prepare the young woman for what lay ahead. Since most were getting married at 15 or 16, with zero education and a vague fear that men were just very large, confusing beasts, the men didn't fare much better. Grooms were often pulled aside by their own version of marital tutors, usually older brothers or local farmers who'd already fathered half a dozen children. The advice was equally poetic. Find your rhythm like tilling soil, or if she kicks, it means she likes you. One 14th century English guide for rural husbands advised, take her with gentleness, lest you plant a crooked seed. No clarification was given, and that line haunts us still. Of course, there were also the remedies, because if things went wrong, there was no doctor or bishop to fix you. There was your grandmother's herb shelf. Local cunning women provided all kinds of cures for bedroom issues. Men might be given nettle root tea, or told to sleep with an acorn in their underpants, for virility. Women were advised to place rosemary beneath the pillow, wear red string around their waist, or consume raw onion mixed with honey before lying with their husband. No one explains what the onion was supposed to do. It probably just cleared the room of everyone except the husband. Fringe fact of the night. In parts of the Netherlands, it was traditional for the bride's mother to stay in the house during the consummation, usually in the next room. If the marriage wasn't completed by dawn, she was allowed to enter the chamber and assist with encouragement. No further detail was given, but one has to assume this was emotional guidance and not. Anything more horrifying? Hopefully. There's also the question of bedding materials. Peasant beds were not plush mattresses or silken canopies. More often it was a lumpy pile of straw, sometimes covered in old cloth, maybe a woolen blanket if you were lucky. Some couples didn't even have a dedicated bed, just a corner of the room marked off with a curtain or a low wooden frame. In these settings, the idea of romance wasn't entirely absent, but it was more practical than passionate. You had a job to do, and if you were nervous, there was probably a sheep staring at you in the corner, and yet some found joy in it. Among all the expectations and village gossip, some couples quietly fell in love, or at least into a tolerable rhythm. They laughed through their nerves, they whispered promises by candlelight. They figured it out together, without midwives or monks muttering about debitum coniugale. Maybe it was clumsy, maybe it was sweet. Maybe they just laid there and held hands because they were both terrified. But it belonged to them, so no, peasant wedding nights weren't exactly private, but they were real, messy, human, imperfect. And in a world where everyone watched everything, maybe a marriage that started with laughter, awkwardness, and a lumpy straw mattress was better than one sealed under royal eyes and church scrolls. At least in the morning no one expected you to show a sheet. You've made it through the night. Bruised in body and spirit, maybe a little wiser, maybe just more tired. But before you start building a quiet life with your new spouse, before you assume the worst is behind you, there's one more looming presence you can't ignore. You've dealt with the family. You've endured the guests. You've humoured the servants and narrowly escaped an impotency trial. But now comes the quiet authority that hovers above all of it, silently shaping everything from your mattress to your morals, the church. Yes, the church didn't just set the rules for how you married, it decided how you behaved in bed, how often you did it, what positions were allowed, and when it was considered a sin. Your marital life wasn't just monitored by your in-laws and a few too curious maids, it was being measured, metaphorically and sometimes literally, by God, or more accurately by a bunch of unmarried men in robes who thought they understood human desire because they'd read about it in Latin. Let's start with the basics. Marriage was a sacrament. That meant it wasn't just a social contract, it was a sacred one. And consummation, that was the holy glue that sealed the deal. Without it, the marriage wasn't valid. But even once you'd done your duty, the church didn't step back and say, "Great, enjoy each other." No, it leaned in closer and whispered rules. Many, many rules. First, the church laid out a calendar of when sex was permitted. And spoiler alert, it was rarely. Sundays? No. Fridays? Absolutely not too holy. Lent? Forget it. Advent? Also no. Feast days? Not a chance. Days before feast days? Still no. Days after? Maybe, if you'd confessed recently. The total number of approved days hovered around 90 per year if you were lucky and extremely devout. Wanted to break those rules? Then you'd better be okay with confessing that you defile the liturgical calendar with your loins. Then there were the positions. The church had a strong opinion on what was natural. Missionary, of course, man on top, face to face, no funny business. Anything else, side by side, seated, standing, or from behind, was considered the sin of Sodom. Lumped in with acts the church found so unspeakable, they were only mentioned in vague, trembling Latin. The general idea was that sex should look like an act of reproduction. If it looked too much like fun, and it was probably heresy. Oral sex, forbidden, mutual pleasure, suspicious, excessive moaning, downright demonic. Some clerics believed that a woman enjoying herself too much during intercourse could accidentally summon evil spirits. Yes, you heard that right. There were writings that described excessive female delight as a gateway to temptation, possession, and, somehow, crop failure. So congratulations! You didn't just ruin your soul, you also cursed your neighbour's turnips. Of course, not every priest agreed on how strict to be. There were debates. Theologians argued over how much desire was too much, whether a husband could sin by loving his wife too eagerly, and if pleasure could ever be part of a holy union. One French bishop argued that laughter during intimacy was the mark of a light soul. Another insisted that as long as both parties intended to procreate, anything short of animal mimicry was acceptable. That term was never clearly defined, but safe to assume the bar was low. Let's talk about confessions. In many towns, especially during Lent, priests would ask married couples directly about their sexual habits. Had they followed the calendar? Had they tried anything outside the accepted positions? Had they engaged with unclean thoughts? These weren't rhetorical questions. People were expected to answer, and failure to do so might result in penance. Not just prayers, but fasts, restrictions from communion or public humiliation. Imagine being banned from Sunday Mass because your husband was a little too enthusiastic on a Tuesday. If you think that's bad, consider the church's stance on pregnancy. Getting pregnant was the goal, but once you were, sex was discouraged or outright forbidden. Some clerics believed that intercourse during pregnancy could mix the humours and deform the child. Others claimed it introduced sin into the womb. One English priest even wrote that coupling during pregnancy invites the devil to join in the act, which raises a lot of theological questions and not enough scientific ones. Here's a lesser-known fact. There were actual church-sanctioned sex manuals, not the fun kind. These were grim little tomes with titles like De Matrimonio and Summa Theologica, where men who'd taken vows of chastity described what married people could and couldn't do under their own sheets. They read like instructional pamphlets for intimacy as imagined by someone who's only ever seen two goats bump into each other and called it love. One particularly infamous rule came from penitentials, books of sins and their associated punishments. According to one 12th century version, if a man had sex with his wife while thinking about another woman, he had to fast for 7 years. 7 years. No meat, no wine, no sex, and presumably a lifetime of marital side-eye. Let's not forget about the role of the priest as enforcer. If a marriage appeared lustful or unbalanced, the local confessor might step in. Couples were encouraged to seek spiritual guidance for lustful thoughts, even within marriage. A noblewoman in 14th century Burgundy confessed that her husband liked to touch her feet while smiling during their union. The priest made her sleep in stockings for the next 3 months. Whether or not it worked? Well, the husband took up falconry, and she took a vow of silence. Fringe fact time, in parts of rural Spain, there was a practice where couples would mark their front door with chalk during certain holy seasons to indicate they were abstaining. It was seen as a sign of piety. In one case, a newlywed forgot to draw the mark during Lent, and his neighbours reported him to the priest. The man was made to publicly recite a psalm while holding a bowl of ice under his robes, because nothing says repentance like frozen shame. Scholars today debate how rigorously these rules were enforced. Some believe most couples ignored them and just confessed afterward. Others argue that the church's grip was tighter than we assume, especially in towns where priests held both spiritual and civic power. Either way, the rules existed. They shaped expectations, and they created an environment where desire was regulated as tightly as tithes. So here you are, married, monitored, and morally audited. You look at your spouse and wonder if that thing you tried last week was natural or a ticket to damnation. You wonder if the priest will ask about it. You wonder if God noticed. And suddenly the bed that once felt like a private refuge now feels more like a confessional. In medieval marriage, there was no such thing as a free night. Just sanctioned intimacy, calendared copulation, and a lot of strategic silence. The wedding's over, the sheets have been inspected. The family has stopped circling like curious hawks, and the village gossip has settled, for now. You've survived your first night of marital scrutiny, maybe even managed a moment of clumsy affection between rounds of awkward, religious guilt and folk remedies. But don't get too comfortable. Because in the medieval world, the wedding night wasn't a finish line, it was a starting gun. You've officially entered the next phase of pressure, performance and probing questions, breeding an heir. Forget poetry, forget candlelight. Your body, particularly if you're the bride, is now a tool, a conduit, a vessel waiting to be filled. You're no longer just someone's spouse, you're a reproductive machine, and the entire household has quietly begun counting the days, watching your waistline and speculating about your colour, appetite and mood. Did you eat less at supper? Must be with child. Did you faint in the garden? Surely a blessed womb. Or maybe you just skipped breakfast because you're tired of being treated like a royal hen. Among nobles and wealthy families, the pressure to produce a child, preferably a male one, was immense. It wasn't just personal, it was political. A child meant security. It meant continuity. It meant that all the land grabbing and dowry negotiations and wedding night dramatics hadn't been in vain. And so once the bedding ceremony ended, the real surveillance began. Every missed cycle, every fever, every moment of nausea was noted, discussed, and usually exaggerated until it snowballed into premature celebration. And that celebration could come fast. There are documented cases of noble women being declared pregnant within days of their wedding. Not because anyone could possibly know, but because optimism and blind hope were cheaper than waiting. One poor countess in 14th century Saxony was paraded through the estate gardens as our glorious mother-to-be less than 72 hours after her wedding. She hadn't even unpacked her jewellery. Of course, once the initial enthusiasm died down, the waiting became sharper. 3 months in and still no signs. Whispers started. 6 months? Now the prayers began. A year? People used the word curse. 2 years? The marriage was quietly considered troubled, and you could count on at least one relative sending you a vial of something labelled fertility wine, and containing ingredients that would terrify modern scientists. So what did trying for a child look like, practically speaking? Not romantic evenings and hopeful anticipation. More like calendar charts scratched into the church walls and sex assigned like farm chores. Couples were instructed to time their unions according to the moon, their wife's pulse, the humidity or which saints' days were known for fertility. Tuesday, blessed. Wednesday, neutral. Thursday, too close to Friday and therefore suspect. If you were noble, your chamber might be prepared on scheduled nights for baby-making attempts. Certain herbs would be burned, special sheets laid down, and in some households, specific relics, bones of child-protecting saints, bits of holy cloth, or in one French case, a sliver of Mary's veil, placed under the bed or tied to the bedposts. Yes, really. The relic was tied like a charm while servants whispered prayers in the hallway. Romance. Women bore the brunt of these expectations, of course. Their bodies became communal property the moment they married, subject to observation and commentary from the entire household. Swollen ankles, womb is ready, sore back, that's the spine shifting for the baby, nothing happening at all. Clearly for you were too cold of flesh, or cursed, or guilty of hidden sin. The explanations were endless, and all of them terrifying. And the solutions, equally bizarre. Fertility cures included potions made from sheep's milk and ashes, fumigating the womb with incense, and the ever-popular womb massage, administered by a village midwife who would chant softly while pushing your abdomen around like a sack of barley. Some noble women were instructed to sit on warmed bricks infused with cinnamon oil to encourage blood to descend. Others were told to sleep with their legs tied together after intercourse so the seed may not escape. Medieval science, everybody. Let's not forget the involvement of saints. St. Anne, St. Margaret and St. Gerard were the go-to spiritual authorities for infertility. Women would pray for weeks at specific shrines, sometimes barefoot, sometimes fasting, sometimes offering their hair or wedding ring in exchange for divine intervention. One woman in Italy walked 400 miles to place a carved wooden cradle at the feet of the Virgin Mary. She became pregnant 5 months later. Coincidence or miracle, she didn't care, and neither did her in-laws. And here's your quirky side fact. In parts of Bohemia and Moravia, childless couples would hire a travelling womb singer, an older woman who would chant songs believed to wake the slumbering womb. She'd sing, dance, and wave branches of birch over the couple's bed. She was paid in cheese, beer, or occasionally a live chicken. Whether it worked, debatable. But you can imagine how awkward it was to lie there while someone rhythmically yelled at your uterus in ancient Slavic verse. Now, if a child did come, there was temporary celebration. A pregnancy meant the marriage was solid, proof of consummation, vindication of the wedding night, and a reason for the village priest to breathe a sigh of relief. But that happiness came with a new kind of pressure. Make it a boy. Sons meant inheritance, continuity, status. Daughters were blessings too, but they were blessings wrapped in financial inconvenience and future dowry planning. Some families kept fertility ledgers, actual records of conception attempts and outcomes. If you think modern apps are invasive, imagine your mother-in-law writing "third failed month, ate too many pears" in the Household Chronicle. Some noble estates even had a fertility matron on staff, a woman whose entire job was to manage, observe, and report on the lady of the house's reproductive status. Not the kind of company you want while brushing your hair in the morning. And if a couple remained childless for too long, the consequences ranged from awkward silence to legal disaster. Annulments were back on the table, infidelity was suspected, accusations of witchcraft were whispered. A man might be encouraged openly to take a mistress in hopes of testing his seed. A woman might be returned to her father's house for inspection. And if she was lucky, that's all that happened. Scholars have long debated how much of this obsession with the heirs trickled down to the lower classes. Among peasants, children were certainly valuable, but less for inheritance and more for labour. Still, even in a one-room hut, a childless marriage was cause for concern. A barren womb could be blamed on demons, past sins, or sleeping during church sermons. One farmer's wife in Normandy was told her womb was haunted by the ghost of a goat she'd once kicked. Her solution? She apologised to the goat's spirit and conceived the following spring. So now, months after your wedding, you lie in bed counting days, watching the stars, sipping something herbal that smells like old soup, while your spouse stares at the ceiling wondering whether he's allowed to try again on a saint's feast day. Outside, the household waits. Inside, your body is no longer just yours. It's a contract, a clock, a battlefield, and the most private part of your life is still public property. The days pass, then weeks, and now, every time you so much as yawn or glance at a loaf of bread for longer than 5 seconds, someone asks if you're expecting. The housekeeper is watching. The chambermaid is watching. Even the stable boy tilts his head when you rub your back after sitting too long. And if you cough, that's it. The village midwife is already on her way, clutching a pouch of herbs and muttering prayers. But nothing happens. No pregnancy, no swelling belly, no heir. And so naturally, the marriage begins to unravel. Not emotionally necessarily, but legally. Because in the medieval world, love didn't hold a marriage together. A sheet did. More specifically, the sheet from your wedding night. That same stained or suspiciously unstained linen that started this whole affair may now be dragged back into the spotlight as evidence. Welcome to the odd and disturbingly public tradition of bedsheets as legal documents. Let's back up a bit. In medieval Europe, especially among nobles and landowning families, the idea of proof was everything. Words could be denied, witnesses could be bribed, but a blood-stained sheet? That was ironclad. Or at least it seemed like it. So the night after the wedding, once the couple had done their expected duty, or pretended to, those linens were collected, examined and often stored. Not just for sentimentality, but for future legal use. These were literal exhibits of consummation, hung from rafters, displayed to guests. In some cases, they were folded with ceremonial care and handed to the bride's mother as proof of honour. Think of it as the medieval version of a marriage licence, only flimsier and significantly more awkward to hold during a family reunion. And what happened to these sheets over time? Well, in many noble households they were preserved like relics, stored in trunks, pressed between layers of wool, even catalogued. Some families had a designated linen chest that held not only wedding garments, but also proof sheets from multiple generations. If a later dispute arose about inheritance, legitimacy, or annulment, those old bed sheets could be hauled out like courtroom evidence. Sounds extreme? It gets better. In one particularly surreal case from 15th century Belgium, a nobleman's second wife accused his daughter from the first marriage of being illegitimate, born of a union never consummated. The daughter, now married herself, was forced to present the original bedsheet from her parents' wedding night to prove she had been born of a true and valid marriage. The sheet was yellowed, brittle, and covered in suspicious red smudges. Whether they were from the wedding night or some unfortunate wine spill was never clarified. The court accepted it anyway. The second wife was fined for slander. The sheet, apparently, had spoken. Sometimes, though, the sheet itself wasn't enough. Enter the idea of forged evidence. Yes, forged sheets. In regions where virginity was currency and heirs meant land, families occasionally faked the blood. Chicken blood was a favourite, easy to come by, but convincing in colour and conveniently close at hand in most kitchens. Maids were trained to dab just the right amount onto linen, too much and it looked theatrical, too little and it failed to satisfy the curious eyes of watching relatives. One apocryphal tale from France involves a servant accidentally using beet juice instead of blood. The resulting magenta stain was so vivid that guests believed the bride had suffered internal hemorrhaging. The physician was summoned. A second bedding was demanded. The servant, for the record, was quietly reassigned to the laundry. But what if the sheet was clean, and genuinely so? That's when people started pointing fingers. Was the bride a liar? Was the groom incapable? Was someone hiding something? That clean linen became a blank canvas for accusations, and the longer a couple went without producing children, the more pressure there was to revisit the scene of the crime, literally. In some church courts, the absence of blood on a wedding sheet was considered grounds for annulment. A noblewoman in Austria was returned to her father's house after her husband claimed she hadn't bled on their wedding night. She insisted she had. Her mother produced a sheet with faint staining only to be accused of planting it. The court summoned 3 female witnesses, midwives, to examine the sheet and testify about its authenticity. One said the stain looked like dried rosewater. The marriage was annulled. The bride was labelled suspect. The sheet presumably was burned. Here's your fringe fact. In parts of Eastern Europe it was traditional to embroider the wedding sheet with religious symbols, crosses, lambs, doves. If the couple failed to consummate the marriage, the sheet was unpicked, the thread burned and the symbols remade the following year for a second attempt. A priest would re-bless the sheet. The couple would be paraded again into the chamber. The whole wedding would be spiritually restarted, as though they were stuck in a pious time loop, doomed to replay the worst night of their lives until someone blushed hard enough. Even outside court, sheets were used as social leverage. A woman's family might present a blood-stained sheet to silence rumours about her virtue. A man might show one off to assert dominance over rival suitors or prove he hadn't been duped. In towns where gossip travelled faster than horses, the existence or non-existence of a wedding sheet could determine your future, your ability to remarry, your inheritance, even your freedom. Of course, not all of this was fair. Many women didn't bleed on their wedding night, not because they weren't virgins, but because human anatomy isn't a medieval morality play. But try telling that to a room full of men who believe that virtue leaks visibly and conveniently on demand. Women who didn't bleed were sometimes subjected to virginity tests after the wedding, or worse, sent back for a second bedding with a more trustworthy witness stationed just outside the curtain. Modern historians argue over how literal all of this was. Did every household really keep sheets? Were they inspected with that much scrutiny? Or was it more of a symbolic gesture, proof in theory, not practice? The truth likely lies somewhere in the middle. But what's undeniable is that the belief in the sheet's power shaped behaviour, choices and lives. And so you find yourself weeks into marriage being asked by your mother-in-law if she can take another peek at the linen from your wedding night. Or your husband's pacing in the hall with a folded piece of fabric under his arm, on his way to court to prove that you're not barren, you're just unlucky. You sit there, silent, remembering the moment that stain appeared, real or faked, painful or uneventful, and wonder how a square of cloth came to define your entire future. It's not just a sheet, it's a story, one everyone feels entitled to read. There's something unnerving about a closed door in a quiet house, especially when everyone knows what's supposed to be happening behind it. But what if the bride doesn't want to open that door? What if she doesn't want to go inside at all? What if, when the music ends and the guests are ushering her toward the marital bed with wine and laughter and veiled hints, she freezes? What if she says no? In modern times, a bride refusing her husband would be met, ideally, with understanding, patience and a conversation. But in the Middle Ages, that no was dangerous, because a woman's consent, especially after the wedding vows were exchanged, wasn't really part of the equation. Consent was assumed, absorbed into the contract like dowry and property and heir-making potential. You were married, therefore your body was now community-approved territory. So when a bride resisted the wedding night, whether out of fear, trauma, religious conviction or sheer disinterest, it didn't just make people uncomfortable. It was seen as a direct violation of her duties, an affront to the husband, the families, the church, and occasionally the king. It was also incredibly rare to find her side of the story recorded. But a few flickers of resistance survive in the historical record, and they are as tragic as they are telling. Take, for instance, a 14th century case from Provence, where a young noblewoman, just 14, locked herself in a chamber the night of her wedding and refused to come out. Her new husband and several members of the wedding party spent hours outside, coaxing, threatening, praying. A priest even attempted to bless the doorframe, as if divine persuasion might change her mind. Eventually the door was forced open. The girl was found curled under the bed, clutching a wooden cross and reciting psalms. She was declared spiritually unwell and sent to a convent for cleansing. The marriage was never consummated. Her family disavowed her. She died in religious isolation at 21. Stories like hers rarely had happy endings. Resistance wasn't just inconvenient. It was a threat to the social fabric. A woman who said no to her husband could be labelled rebellious, ungrateful, unholy, even possessed. In some regions, especially where superstition ran thick, refusal on the wedding night was attributed to witchcraft. The bride had been cursed. Or she was the curse. In either case, the solution was correction. Prayer, isolation, or, in horrifying cases, force. Because yes, sometimes force was used. Medieval law had a complicated, often contradictory view of marital rape. Technically, church doctrine emphasized that spouses should come together willingly, and that force contradicted the sanctity of the marital bed. But in practice, the law offered little protection for a bride who didn't want to participate. Once married, she was considered bound, not just in legal status, but in flesh. Her refusal could be overridden, her protest dismissed, her silence, ironically, often taken as consent, and sometimes her suffering was codified in writing. In one court case from England, a groom admitted that his bride had wept and resisted during their first night, but insisted she was merely frightened and soon stilled. The court not only accepted this account, they praised him for his patience. The marriage was declared valid. The bride, she never appeared in court. Not all cases ended so bleakly. In a few rare instances, a bride's refusal was upheld, usually if she came from significant power or wealth. A German duchess famously delayed consummation for nearly a year, citing bowel illness and religious fasting. Her husband, apparently more interested in her estate than her company, accepted the delay until political pressures mounted. Eventually he filed for annulment. The church ruled in her favour, stating that a woman could not be compelled if her body be weak and her soul devout. She kept her dowry. He remarried within 6 months. Then there were the silent resistances, the passive ones, brides who complied outwardly but mentally withdrew, who lay still, who found ways to avoid intimacy altogether, using the calendar as their weapon. They cited the wrong holy days, they invented fasting periods, they insisted on extended separations for prayer, some faked illness, others claimed visions, or one noblewoman in Burgundy reportedly claimed that the Virgin Mary had appeared to her and forbade her from consummating her marriage until a shrine was built in her honour. The husband, afraid to challenge the divine, funded a small chapel. The marriage was never completed. The woman took holy orders at 30. Fringe fact of the night: in parts of medieval Lithuania, a bride could, symbolically, refuse her husband by placing a small knife under her pillow on the wedding night. It was a silent signal that she was not ready. Some grooms respected it, others removed it without comment. In one folk tale, a groom lifted the knife, cut his own palm and said, "Let both bleed tonight, or neither." That story ends in poetic tragedy, of course. They always do, but not all resistance was tragic. Some women pushed back and survived. They forged lives outside the confines of their forced unions. They found lovers. They joined religious orders. They became midwives, herbalists, even property holders. Their names don't always survive, but their actions ripple through records and folklore and letters. They resisted, in a world that told them they couldn't. Scholars still argue about how widespread these refusals were. Were most women aren't because they accepted their fate, or because the consequences of saying no were so terrifying they couldn't risk it? Likely both. But even the few surviving stories remind us that beneath the layers of ritual and duty, real people lived these nights, with fear, with defiance, with agency, sometimes crushed and sometimes preserved in desperate flickers. So now, back in your imagined chamber, the music gone, the torches low, you lie beside a stranger. Or perhaps a familiar face you still fear. The door is closed, but you don't feel safe. You listen to their breath. You feel your heart thudding in your chest. And you wonder, what if I say no? Will they hear me? Will they stop? Will they care? Because on this night the wedding may be over, but your voice is still fighting to be heard. It always starts the same way. Someone's looking too long. A glance that lingers just a beat too long across the banquet table. A smile exchanged by candlelight that feels warmer than friendship. Or a hand that brushes another under the guise of retrieving a goblet. In a world where most marriages were forged for political gain or livestock exchanges, emotional intimacy, let alone physical desire, often bloomed outside the marriage bed. And so, while everyone was watching the sheets for stains and counting months for pregnancies, something else was unfolding in the shadowed corridors: infidelity. Medieval marriages, for all their scrutiny and sanctity, were rarely about passion. Most couples entered the union as strangers, expected to become productive spouses before they ever became companions. Love, if it showed up at all, arrived late and was never guaranteed. So it's no surprise that affairs happened, frequently, quietly, and occasionally spectacularly. What is surprising is how deeply the entire court or village could get involved in the drama, especially when it intersected with the all-important act of consummation. Let's begin with the noble class. High-born ladies often had more freedom than we imagine, especially once they'd fulfilled their primary obligation, producing an heir. A duchess who gave birth to a son might suddenly find herself with time, status, and an inattentive husband who spent more nights hawking than home. Enter the poet, the squire, the well-dressed steward with excellent cheekbones. And suddenly, the bedchamber wasn't the only place for passion, it was just the one everyone pretended to believe in. Affairs among nobles were open secrets, especially in places like 14th century France and Italy, where courtly love culture romanticised forbidden desire. A lady might receive a secret token, a ribbon, a glove, a brooch, and keep it tucked in her bodice while sitting beside her husband at church. Some trysts were brief, others lasted years. Some resulted in illegitimate children passed off as legitimate. And when questions arose, that's where things got interesting. A child born too early after the wedding, or one who bore an unfortunate resemblance to the chamberlain, could spark chaos. Families would revisit the wedding night's details. Was there blood? Was it seen? Did they truly consummate? And if doubt crept in, entire estates could be lost in the shuffle. Because if the first bedding hadn't really happened, or hadn't happened properly, then maybe the marriage wasn't valid. And if the marriage wasn't valid, the child wasn't legitimate. And if the child wasn't legitimate, well, someone else was about to inherit everything. That's why so much weight was placed on those early proofs of intimacy. They didn't just mark a night, they marked the start of a legal claim. Even years later, a clean sheet or an overheard argument could become evidence in inheritance disputes, and when adultery was suspected, the marriage bed itself became a battleground of accusation and denial. It wasn't just women having affairs, of course. Men strayed often, and with significantly less risk. Noblemen frequently kept mistresses, sometimes with their wives' reluctant blessing. In one infamous English household, the lord's mistress was housed just 3 chambers down from his wife's room. Servants gossiped. The wife drank. Everyone pretended it was normal. The mistress bore 3 children. The wife bore none. When the lord died, he left his title to his wife's nephew and his lands to his mistress's sons. The will was contested for decades. Among peasants, affairs were more practical and less poetic. A lonely husband might be drawn to a neighbour's widow. A wife, neglected or beaten, might find comfort in a farmhand's arms. In villages where homes had no real walls, these liaisons were rarely secret, but they were often tolerated, unless a pregnancy occurred. Then the finger-pointing began. Let's bring in your fringe story. In 15th century Saxony, a miller's wife gave birth to a boy with bright red hair, despite neither she nor her husband having such a trait. The local priest accused her of adultery with a travelling musician. The woman swore that the child was a miracle of St. Hubert, who had appeared to her in a dream and promised fertility. The court wasn't convinced. The musician was chased from town, the child was raised in silence and eventually became a priest, just in case. Adultery wasn't just a personal betrayal. It was a religious offence, a sin, and if it corrupted the marriage line, it became a social and legal threat. That's why infidelity wasn't just punished, it was spectacularly punished. In some towns, adulterers were forced to wear symbolic clothing, horns, ropes, or painted marks. In others, they were paraded through the streets holding hands, made to confess publicly while villagers jeered. Some were fined, others were branded, and a few, especially women, were locked away in convents or monasteries never to be seen again. For all the shame and punishment, the hypocrisy ran deep. Men were often forgiven with a slap on the wrist. Women, however, were held to the impossible standard of constant virtue, even if their husbands were distant, cruel, or simply uninterested. A wife could be neglected for years and still be expected to remain chaste. A man could father 6 bastards and be called spirited. This double standard was painfully visible during annulment trials. If a woman was accused of adultery, her entire past could be dragged into court, her virginity questioned, her wedding night re-examined, witnesses summoned to testify about how loudly the bed had creaked. But a man, he could confess to a lover and still be considered a victim of a cold or barren wife. It wasn't fair, it wasn't subtle, but it was common. That's why some women, especially the clever ones, took precautions. They kept their affairs quiet, chose discreet partners, and ensured there was always a servant loyal enough to lie. One countess in Burgundy arranged for a midwife to smuggle a stillbirth from another village into her chambers so she could claim her affair's child was her husband's. The deception worked for 17 years, until the midwife confessed on her deathbed. The estate was seized, the child disappeared, the countess died in exile. Not all stories ended in ruin. Some lovers escaped, some spouses forgave, a few marriages even recovered, their secrets buried in household silence and soft denials. But one thing remained constant, the connection between the wedding night and everything that followed. That first bedding was the cornerstone, the proof, the moment that should have ensured fidelity and legitimacy. But people are people, and sometimes they want more than a contract sealed by torchlight and an audience. So now, months into your marriage, you notice your spouse looking elsewhere. Or maybe it's you watching someone across the courtyard, feeling that flutter of attention you never got on your wedding night. And in that moment, you remember. The sheets may have been stained, the priest may have smiled, the family may have cheered, but none of that guarantees loyalty. In a world obsessed with proof, desire still found ways to slip through the cracks. The wedding night may have been the centerpiece of medieval matrimony, but it was never just about sex. It was about symbolism, of transition, of submission, of power. Nowhere was that more apparent than in the rituals that followed, the strange little performances that lingered in the days and weeks after the bedding. Because in the Middle Ages, even once the bed was cooled and the blood had dried, you were never quite finished proving you were married. Your body may have been spoken for, but your reputation still had miles to go. And so began the bizarre practice of post-consummation rituals, where the intimacy of the bedchamber spilled into the public sphere with songs, processions, and occasionally livestock. Let's begin with the most theatrical of them, the morning parade. In certain towns, especially in parts of Germany, France, and the Low Countries, newlyweds were expected to emerge the morning after their wedding and present themselves to the community, not just looking well rested, radiant. The groom would be nudged forward, chin high, maybe still wearing bits of last night's ceremony garb. The bride, ideally, would walk a step behind, modest but visibly glowing. Bonus points for mussed hair and reddened cheeks. You weren't supposed to describe the night, of course, but your posture was supposed to imply satisfaction. This parade sometimes came with music, crude flute melodies, drum beats, and songs with lyrics that were thinly veiled euphemisms. Local boys might bang pots and shout suggestive jokes. Old women would call out blessings. Occasionally, the village baker would offer a fertility loaf, thick, round, and unmistakably shaped like exactly what you think. And if that loaf accidentally rolled down the street, even better. A clear sign that the couple would soon be parents. More intimate communities had their own spin. In some parts of Scotland, neighbours would pin small tokens to the couple's clothes. A feather if the bride was still walking stiffly, a sprig of mint if she looked too calm. In Wales, the couple would be asked to dance the dawn, a slow shuffle through the village square that symbolised unity and cooperation. If they stumbled or fought for the lead, it was taken as an omen. One documented case describes a bride who refused to take her husband's hand during the dance. He tried to spin her anyway. She elbowed him in the ribs. The priest reportedly sighed and said, "We shall need more prayers." Then came the gift-giving, but not the warm and fuzzy kind. Family members, especially mothers-in-law, would present the couple with items meant to solidify the union. A blanket with embroidered fertility symbols, a chalice said to bless the womb. In one Italian court, it was customary for the bride's parents to deliver a live goose to the new couple's door. If the bird honked when it saw them, it meant they'd have sons. If it walked away, daughters. If it died on the doorstep, abstain for a week and try again. Some of these rituals were more intimate, shared only among the household. The groom might be expected to recount the night to a close friend or brother. The bride, in turn, would have a post-bed bath with her attendants, who'd wash her with scented water and comment, quietly but pointedly, on any bruises or bite marks. This wasn't for gossip, it was for confirmation. Everything from the condition of her skin to the way she winced when sitting could become part of the silent report passed up the household chain. And then came the prayers. Because just in case you thought the church was done with you, here comes another round. Couples were expected to attend Mass together on the morning after, sitting side by side and looking appropriately grateful. One priest's journal from 1372 describes a newlywed pair kneeling during communion, the bride limping slightly, the groom beaming as if he'd conquered a mountain. The sermon that day was about humility and resisting lust. Medieval irony at its finest. Here's your fringe fact. In certain parts of medieval Croatia, there was a ritual known as the bed walk. The couple's wedding bed, stained sheets and all, was physically carried through the village by male relatives. Yes, the actual mattress. As they walked, the relatives would chant rhymes, make bawdy jokes, and encourage the groom to fill the bed again before the sun sets. The bride mercifully wasn't required to attend. The bed was returned at nightfall with a jar of honey placed under the pillow as a blessing. Ants were not accounted for. Of course, not all these rituals were celebratory. Sometimes they turned passive-aggressive. If a couple failed to produce evidence of consummation, no blood, no flushed faces, no sheepish grins, then the following morning's rituals might turn sharp. Neighbours would hum off key. Servants might forget to prepare breakfast. One lord in Normandy was greeted the morning after his wedding with a silent house and a single potato placed on his pillow. The message, "Plant something, please," and heaven help the couple who actively refused to participate. Skipping the morning mass. People assumed shame, avoiding the dance, clearly not unified, declining the fertility loaf. You might as well wear a sign that said, "No heirs coming. Thanks." The post-consummation rituals weren't optional. They were expected, they were watched, and they served one purpose, to make sure your wedding night hadn't been a wasted effort. There were even travelling entertainers, jokers, poets, singers, who specialised in post-wedding performances. They'd craft rhymes tailored to the couple's personalities, full of cheeky lines like, "He rode like a knight, she sang like a belle, and together they fell where no one could tell." One English bard was infamous for a closing verse that went, "The fire is warm, the bed is wide, may none be found where they did hide." It was a compliment, allegedly. Modern scholars still debate the psychological impact of these rituals. Were they genuinely joyful, harmless tradition, or did they add yet another layer of performance pressure to an already fragile, unfamiliar union? Some argue that the communal nature offered support. Others insist it was just another surveillance method dressed in flowers and flute music. Either way, they were deeply embedded in medieval marital culture. So now you're standing in your doorway at sunrise, your body sore, your smile plastered, your spouse beside you looking either smug or mildly ill. A neighbour offers a loaf. A servant smirks. The priest raises a hand in blessing. And you walk forward into the day surrounded by eyes, enveloped by ritual. Your private night now firmly woven into the fabric of the public world. You don't just marry your spouse. You marry the performance. Every step, every glance, every twitch of your new life will be watched and interpreted. And you thought the wedding night was the hard part. By now, the newlyweds are no longer newly. The wedding night is weeks, maybe months behind them. The stained sheet has either been lauded as evidence of virtue or quietly forgotten in a linen chest. The procession's long gone. The awkward jokes have faded. But something else lingers, something less theatrical and more unsettling. The creeping anxiety that maybe, just maybe, it didn't count. Because here's the thing. Consummation wasn't just a social rite or an act of religious duty. It was a legal cornerstone. And in the labyrinth of medieval canon and civil law, if the marriage wasn't consummated, it could be declared invalid. Entire unions, long-standing, public, with lands and titles exchanged, could be unravelled if someone, years later, stood up and declared, "We never actually did it." And the courts would listen. This wasn't just theoretical. It happened. A lot. The Church defined consummation as the physical uniting of the spouses, a phrase that sounds gentle enough until you realise how it played out in legal settings. There had to be penetration, preferably with omission, and it had to be willful, mutual in theory, and unimpeded by fraud or coercion. If any of those boxes were unchecked, the marriage was vulnerable to annulment, which, unlike divorce, meant the marriage never legally existed. This is where it gets messy. Let's say a couple marries. They sleep in the same bed. Everyone assumes they've done their duty, but years pass, no children appear, and then one spouse, let's say the husband, claims they never consummated. Maybe he wants to remarry. Maybe he wants to reclaim a dowry. Maybe he just regrets the whole thing. If he's persuasive enough, the case goes to ecclesiastical court. And that's when the real circus begins, because now the court has to prove whether sex occurred. And in a world without cameras, DNA tests, or reliable documentation, proof meant testimony. That's where the public trials of intimacy reached their absolute peak. Both spouses were brought in and questioned, separately at first, then together. Witnesses were called, bedsheets were examined, servants were summoned to describe the couple's behaviour on the wedding night. Did they groan? Was there time enough? Did the floorboards creak? One maid testified in a 15th century English case that she heard a sigh, such as might suggest great effort. It was accepted as evidence. If things still weren't clear, the court might demand a virginity inspection, yes, even years after the wedding. Midwives or matrons, usually 3 or more, would examine the woman and provide a written report about the condition of her body. If they believed she was still a virgin, the case strengthened. If they weren't sure, the court might default to the husband's word. And if the woman protested, she was seen as defensive, possibly deceitful. The odds were rarely in her favour. It didn't stop there. In some annulment trials, men were ordered to prove their impotence, or lack thereof. That meant essentially a court-supervised erection test, sometimes carried out in private chambers, sometimes in front of appointed physicians or even clergy. The man would be instructed to disrobe, be shown certain images, sometimes sacred, sometimes shockingly suggestive, and asked to demonstrate his physical ability. If he succeeded, the marriage was assumed consumable. If he failed, well, that's where the nightmare began. One poor knight in Bohemia was declared permanently impotent after 2 failed trials, one involving a nun reciting poetry, the other involving a roasted chicken and a pair of scented gloves. Don't ask, medieval science was chaos. His wife was granted an annulment. He was shamed for life. Rumours claimed he moved to a monastery, though One local record suggests he remarried quietly and fathered 3 children. So much for certainty. There's also the unsettling matter of consensual fraud. This happened when both parties colluded to pretend the marriage had been consummated, often for the sake of appearances or property rights, when it hadn't. But if the lie was uncovered later, all bets were off. One case from Avignon details a couple who agreed to fake their consummation only to fall in love years later. When the wife finally confessed during confession that their wedding night had been a staged event with damp linens and sheep's blood, the priest reported it. The marriage was annulled. The couple was devastated. He became a monk. She, rather poetically, joined an order of silent nuns. And of course there were revenge annulments. One spouse, angry over infidelity, neglect, or just sheer pettiness, would claim, "We never actually consummated." Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But in every case it dragged their intimate life into the public eye, turned every kiss and cry into legal ammunition. The court, for its part, though, remained both fascinated and deeply uncomfortable. One judge in Cologne is recorded as saying it is a sad thing when the act of union must be weighed like coin. He granted the annulment anyway. Here's your fringe case of the night. In 13th century Aragon, a husband and wife were unable to consummate their marriage because the husband suffered an enchantment that caused him to become ill every time he touched his bride. Doctors, priests, and eventually a travelling magician were brought in. The spell was blamed on a jealous ex-lover, and after a ritual involving beeswax and lamb's blood, the man was allegedly cured. They consummated the marriage under supervision. Yes, supervision. A monk stood outside the door listening for confirmation. He later wrote that he heard the joyful cries of success and declared the union at last valid in the eyes of heaven. Modern scholars look at these trials and often ask, did people really go through with this? The answer is yes, especially in high-profile marriages involving wealth, titles, or alliances. The Church had a vested interest in maintaining the integrity of marriage as a sacrament, and so it took these cases very seriously. But it also opened the door to incredible manipulation. Lies, exaggerations, and coerced testimonies weren't uncommon. And in a world where sex could be declared simultaneously sacred and scandalous, truth was always tangled. So you sit, years after your wedding, thinking everything was secure, then your spouse claims it was never real, that what you thought was a bond was, in the eyes of the law, just pretend, and now you're in a court describing how they touched you where, how long, how it felt. Strangers are judging your performance, your friends are whispering, your future hangs on whether someone believes you cried out loud enough to count. In the medieval world it wasn't enough to marry, you had to prove it, again and again, and sometimes even time proof wasn't enough. The wedding night may have been the stage, the bedding the performance, but long after the torches were snuffed out and the guests stumbled home, the real game of marriage began, played not just in bedsheets or courtrooms, but through rumour. The Middle Ages thrived on garden gossip. Word of mouth was more powerful than parchment, and the most dangerous stories weren't written in scrolls, they were whispered in kitchens, behind church pews, and over mugs of ale in smoky taverns. And nowhere was gossip more potent than when it concerned someone's wedding night. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Even if you consummated your marriage by every rule, on time, with witnesses hovering awkwardly nearby and a relic or two strapped to your bedpost, it didn't mean people would believe you. If someone wanted to ruin you, or your inheritance, or your child's legitimacy, they didn't need a priest or a parchment. They just needed to tell the right story to the right person. Once set loose, rumours could undo what even a pope had blessed. Let's start small. A servant overhears something, maybe your husband complaining that you resisted, or maybe that he just sighs a little too loudly when talking about the wedding night. That's all it takes. The servant repeats it to the cook. The cook tells the merchant's wife. The merchant's wife casually mentions it at Mass. And suddenly, you're that couple. The ones who didn't really do it. The ones who faked it. The ones who might still be unjoined in the eyes of God. It wasn't always malicious. Sometimes it was boredom, sometimes it was jealousy. But the impact was the same. Your reputation became fragile, unravelling like a poorly woven cloak with every careless word. And if you were a woman, your options for defence were slim. You couldn't exactly call a town meeting and reenact your wedding night to silence the doubters. Some families tried damage control. A husband might throw a second feast, subtly implying that everything was fine by filling the hall with meat and mead and aggressive laughter. A wife might host a sewing circle and conspicuously drop references to feeling sore but satisfied. In one bizarre case from rural England, a couple invited their priest to dinner every week for a month, just to subtly prove they were still together, still affectionate, still likely bedding regularly. He eventually stopped coming. The rumours, however, persisted. Then there were the crueler turns, the deliberate slander. A jilted suitor, an angry cousin, a rival family. All it took was a suggestion that the bride hadn't bled, that the groom had hesitated, that someone had slept on the floor instead of in the bed. And the accusation would snowball, morphing from uncertainty into scandal. People started adding details that never happened. A housemaid might claim she saw the bride crying. A stable boy might claim he heard nothing through the walls. And just like that, your entire union came under suspicion. And here's the especially twisted part. The longer you stayed together and didn't produce children, the more credible the rumours became. Even if the wedding night was perfectly by the book, even if you smiled and paraded and went to church every Sunday, childlessness was seen as proof of failure. And failure pointed straight back to the night you were supposed to seal the deal. Some people didn't just doubt your marriage. They doubted your body, your very capacity to perform what was expected. Let's bring in a real-world example, courtesy of medieval Spain. A noblewoman named Inez was married off at 16 to a much older man with a sizable estate. After a quiet wedding and modest bedding ceremony, she kept mostly to herself. No children came. Within a year, local rumours painted her as a frozen bride, suggesting she'd refused her husband in the bed. Her husband, under pressure, admitted they had not yet united. The rumour caught fire. The bishop intervened. Inez was forced to undergo a virginity inspection and sleep again with her husband, this time under oath. He died of illness a few months later. Her reputation, even as a wealthy widow, never fully recovered. Fringe fact for you, in some regions of medieval Poland, it was believed that if no one heard the bride scream on the wedding night, the marriage was spiritually incomplete. So women were expected to perform their pain loudly, so the village could be assured all was in order. If a bride was too quiet, neighbours might gather outside her home the next night and force a scream by banging on the shutters until one was offered. Performative agony, all for reputation's sake. Sometimes the reverse happened. A wife might use gossip to protect herself. If her husband failed in bed, whether through impotence or neglect, she might start whispering about her own heaviness or strange dreams, anything to imply fertility. If people believed she was trying, they were more likely to blame him. Women became masters at weaving stories to redirect suspicion, especially when their survival depended on the house believing she had done her duty. And if things really got dire, that's when people started using superstition. A dry field, clearly the newlyweds didn't consummate properly. A cow dropped dead? Must be the result of a broken wedding night oath. A sick child in the village? Rumour had it the new bride was cursed. Her virginity left intact, her soul out of alignment. It sounds absurd now, but back then people believed a bad wedding night could disrupt the spiritual balance of an entire community. It became everyone's business. The courts knew this too. They didn't just rely on physical proof or testimony. They listened to rumours. If enough people claimed to have heard something, it could tip the scales in a trial. Public voice and fame, it was called, a legal term for gossip, and it carried weight. If your community believed you had failed to consummate, the church might agree, even if the facts said otherwise. So now, long after the sheets have cooled, you're living in a reality where every raised eyebrow and every offhand comment might mean your name is being quietly shredded by suspicion. A hiccup in the market and someone mutters, "Should have screamed louder." A child sneezes and someone blames your barren bed. You see neighbours glance your way during Mass. You hear the priest's sermon on marital duty and feel it land a little too hard. And the worst part, you can't undo it. You can't go back and prove it all over again. You only get one wedding night, one chance to get the whole village, household and heaven on your side. The rest is all hearsay. By now, you're starting to realise something uncomfortable. Something that probably hit medieval brides and grooms right around the same moment it's hitting you. The wedding night wasn't just a strange ordeal tucked between feasting and farming. It was a control mechanism, a ritualised performance designed not just to mark a transition, but to contain people, specifically their bodies, their desires, and their futures. Because when you strip away the roses and relics and perfumed bedsheets, you're left with something harder to swallow. The medieval wedding night was about ownership. That sounds bleak, sure, but consider the facts. From the moment the contract was signed, or in some cases, the moment a bride was sold, everything about her life began shifting under the weight of other people's expectations. Her husband's, yes, but also her father's, her priests, her midwives, her neighbours, her kingdoms, and the consummation. That was the checkmark that said she's been claimed. It wasn't about love, it wasn't about her pleasure, it was about passing a woman from one system of control to another and using the most intimate act imaginable to make it official. And it was always her body that bore the brunt of that transaction. Think about the way the bedding ceremony was structured. Who watched, who waited, who listened at the door. The men toasted, the servants peeked, the priest nodded. And the bride, she was expected to cry, to bleed, to submit, and then to prove she had done all those things correctly. The groom, for all the pressures placed on him, rarely suffered the same scrutiny. If he failed to perform, he was whispered about. If she failed to bleed, she was disgraced. It wasn't equality, it was performance art disguised as sanctity, and it didn't stop at the bedroom door. That same idea of ownership bled, sometimes literally, into every part of married life. A woman's time, no longer hers, her fertility, monitored like a harvest cycle, her behaviour, studied for signs of purity, of piety, of quiet endurance. She was expected to be chaste before the wedding, sexually available after it, and demure throughout. A delicate balance, and heaven help the bride who leaned too far in any direction. It's here that we have to talk about one of the most overlooked aspects of medieval marriage, coercion. We like to believe that arranged marriages involved at least some measure of agreement, that people went along with it because it was the norm. But history is littered with the quiet, painful absence of consent, and that absence didn't end with a reluctant walk down the aisle. It followed people into the bedchamber, where refusal was not only discouraged, it was often impossible. Here's a sobering truth. Once married, a woman had virtually no legal grounds to refuse sex. The term marital debt was tossed around with religious conviction, as if intimacy were a coin you owed your spouse, and if you withheld it, you weren't just denying your husband, you were denying the divine order. One 12th century priest wrote that a wife who refused her husband's touch was a serpent in the house hissing at holy union. Another compared her to Eve, tempting Adam toward ruin with her defiance. So no, you didn't get to say no, not safely. And if you did say ooh, well, the consequences range from social exile to physical violence. In some regions, husbands were permitted to discipline their wives for failing to perform their duties, an ominous euphemism that covered everything from verbal threats to open assault. The church may have preached gentleness, but the courts rarely intervened unless blood was spilled in the streets. The bedroom was sacred, meaning it was off-limits to justice. That's not to say all medieval marriages were prisons. Some couples genuinely grew to love each other, or at least built bonds of companionship and respect. Some husbands defied cultural norms and treated their wives with tenderness. Some wives too found power within the system, especially if they came from wealth or managed to produce multiple heirs. But even then, their agency was always conditional. It existed within a cage, gilded or not. Fringe fact of the night. In parts of medieval Denmark, a woman could petition for annulment if her husband refused to share the bed more than 3 times a month. But the process involved her swearing an oath on her own knees in front of male witnesses while holding a candle. If the flame flickered, it was seen as a sign that she was lying. If she cried, it meant guilt. Only if she kept her eyes dry and the candle steady would the court believe her. So yes, even trying to reclaim control involved a humiliating public ritual where your body betrayed you. You'd think that over time these customs would fade. That logic and decency would win, and eventually they did begin to loosen. The rise of Protestantism, changes in law, and shifts in economic power gave women small inroads toward autonomy. But the echoes of those early power plays never fully disappeared. Even centuries later, the notion that a wedding night seals the deal lingered. In literature, in folklore, in whispered advice passed down between generations. And now, looking back, it's hard not to feel a twinge of anger for those whose first steps into adulthood were choreographed by fear and expectation. Brides who didn't know what was coming until the door closed behind them. Grooms who were told to conquer, not connect. Communities that valued sheets over sincerity, performance over pleasure. So imagine it again, you, newly married, and standing on the edge of your wedding bed like a soldier waiting for orders. your body has become a battlefield where family pride, legal validity, and spiritual salvation all converge in the dark. You glance at your spouse, maybe kind, maybe not, and wonder if they see you as a partner or a prize. Somewhere in the house, a servant listens for sounds. Somewhere in the village, a neighbour stokes a fire and imagines what's happening behind your walls. You've said your vows. You've danced your dance, and now you're supposed to offer yourself up like bread on an altar, and no one asks how you feel about it. In the end, the medieval wedding night wasn't just about proving a marriage. It was about enforcing a hierarchy. Of power, of gender, of the body itself. It demanded your submission. It absorbed your privacy. And if you resisted, it didn't need to punish you in court. It would just let the rumours do the work. Let's say you've made it this far. You survived the vows, the feast, the ritualistic dragging to bed, the creaking floorboards, the ghost of a priest hovering in your subconscious, and the applause of your in-laws when they saw the stained sheet. Maybe you even managed to produce a child or two, or you faked it convincingly enough that people stopped asking. You've played the part. You've danced the dance. You've kept the relics close, the servants quiet, the rumours at bay. But here's the real kicker. Even after all of that, even if you checked every medieval box of proper marital conduct, your wedding night could still be put on trial long after you were gone. Because in the medieval world, your consummation wasn't just a one-night thing. It was a permanent record, a historical landmine, something that could be exhumed, debated, weaponized, and in many cases, it was. This brings us to the posthumous weaponization of intimacy, where the wedding night becomes part of inheritance disputes, dynastic collapses, and political retribution. You may be dead and buried, but if your heirs are alive, your marital performance still matters. A lot. Let's say your grandson is trying to claim your estate. Everything seems in order, except a cousin steps forward and declares, "Their marriage was never valid. I heard they never consummated it." Just ask the steward's son's godfather's uncle. Suddenly the church is re-examining your union. Lawyers, well, clerics in robes, are rifling through records, trying to find someone who saw your stained sheet or heard suspicious sounds, or can vouch that your third child didn't just appear out of nowhere after a mysteriously long pilgrimage. These aren't fringe cases. They're everywhere in medieval records. Annulment after death, bastardy trials, disputes over titles, lands, coats of arms. In 15th century France, a noble family nearly lost their entire inheritance when a long-forgotten cousin returned from exile with a tale that his great-uncle's marriage had never truly begun. His proof? A letter from a dying servant claiming the bride had refused the bedding and that the stained sheet had been forged. The trial dragged on for years. The estate was frozen, crops went untended, a famine hit the region. One bad wedding night, or at least the rumour of one, brought 100 people to ruin. And here's the even darker truth. In some of these cases, the dead were dug up. Literally. Exhumed, examined, and displayed all in the name of clarifying legitimacy. If a noblewoman died childless, or her children were accused of being bastards, her body might be inspected for signs of virginity. It didn't matter that she'd been in the ground for years. Scholars debate whether these examinations were symbolic or sincere, but the records are clear. In medieval Burgundy, one countess was exhumed and examined for tightness of channel, as part of a posthumous annulment case. A midwife testified. The court ruled the marriage unconsummated. The title passed to a cousin. The countess presumably rolled over in her grave. It's grotesque, yes, but also weirdly consistent with the medieval obsession over proving union. Once the idea of proper consummation became the foundation of marriage, it couldn't be left to memory. It had to be documented, witnessed, preserved. And if no one could remember, well, then the bodies would speak. Let's not forget the growing pile of consummation chronicles, documents commissioned by noble families, religious institutions, and ambitious scribes to record every detail of a significant marriage. These weren't love stories, they were legal weapons. One Italian family kept a generational ledger noting how long each marriage took to be consummated, whether the sheet was bloody, who witnessed the act, and what the bride ate afterward. In one case, pears and honey with good appetite. This wasn't family trivia, this was insurance. Fringe fact, in 14th century Hungary there was a tradition of carving small wooden plaques, called bed tokens, inscribed with the date and time of consummation, the couple's names, and a tiny drawing of 2 clasped hands. These plaques were kept in the church registry and blessed annually. If someone contested a marriage decades later, the couple's bed token might be pulled from the archives and held up in court as sacred proof. One scribe's margin note reads, "The hands are clasped, therefore so were the bodies." Medieval logic is nothing if not literal, but it wasn't just aristocrats. Even among peasants, records show that marriages could be questioned posthumously if land or livestock was involved. One farmer's widow in England lost her grazing rights after a neighbour claimed her husband had confessed on his deathbed that they'd never actually consummated their union. She swore he was lying to avoid purgatory. The court remained unconvinced. Her goats were seized. She lived with her sister until her own death, still muttering that he'd been a bitter old fool who never liked beds. You start to see the pattern. A single night, interpreted and reinterpreted across years, decades, generations. A night that was supposed to mark the start of a life together, instead became the eternal scapegoat for anything that went wrong. Bad harvest, bad marriage, no sons, faulty consummation, rival claim, bet the sheets were clean. And yet despite all this, people still married. They still climbed into beds, surrounded by candles and superstition and pressure. Some found love, some found survival, others found a quiet corner of the world where they could write their own version of the ritual, away from priests and whispers and linen inspections. But for those caught in the system, there was no escape from that night. It wasn't just a memory, it was evidence, a transaction, a story that would be told and retold, truth optional. So now, picture yourself years from now, gone, buried, remembered in stained glass windows or forgotten in an unmarked grave, and still someone's asking, did they really consummate? A distant relative digs through crumbling scrolls, a priest dusts off a ledger. Somewhere your name is mentioned, not for your words, your kindness, your wit, but for that night, that act, that sheet. And maybe, just maybe, they don't find an answer. Maybe your story ends with a question mark, blank space in the record, a silent shrug, or maybe, finally, they decide it doesn't matter. So after all that, after the candles, the relics, the gossip, the screaming geese, the beet-stained bed sheets, the virginity inspections, the legally binding erections, the midwives whispering and the monks eavesdropping, you lie there finally in the quiet of your own mind. The torches have burned low. The door is bolted. The house is still. For the first time in this entire ordeal, no one is watching. And you finally get to ask the question no one else thought to, what do I want? You think back to that first night, not the one with the music and the awkward toasts, but the moment the door closed, the breath you held, the way the weight of everyone else's expectations sank onto your chest. Maybe you tried to please them, maybe you resisted, maybe you faked it. Or maybe, miracle of miracles, you found a partner who saw you not as a vessel or a virtue, but as a person. And you carved out something real from a ritual designed to control you, because here's the quiet truth beneath all the noise: you were never meant to win. The medieval wedding night wasn't designed for you, it was designed about you. It choreographed your movements, censored your feelings, gave you a script before you even knew the story, and still you made it. You survived the sheet, the scrutiny, the parade of symbolic loaves and judging midwives and muttering priests. Maybe you played along. Maybe you rebelled. Either way, you're here. And that somehow counts. The rituals are gone now. The relics, the courts, the candlelit inspections, they've crumbled into history books, but the pressure, the stories, the weight of expectation layered over something so human, so private, that still echoes. Maybe that's why we're drawn to it. To these old customs, these strange trials, these awkward, heartbreaking, hilarious moments. They remind us that intimacy has never been just intimacy. It's history, it's performance, its vulnerability, made visible. So now, as the past fades and the hum of the fan takes over, let yourself settle. You've just lived through centuries of uncomfortable truths stitched together with awkward facts and bloody sheets. Let it sink in, the absurdity, the tragedy, the strange poetry of it all. You're no longer on that bed, in that chamber, under those eyes. You're here, safe, unwatched, unjudged, and hopefully finally at peace.